Section 1. The nuclear power plant is poisoning everyone. Let's start with the one that should bother you more than it does. The Springfield nuclear power plant has been sitting on the edge of town since the very first episode of The Simpsons. Cooling towers cracked, warning lights blinking, radioactive runoff trickling into the river while the rest of Springfield goes about its day. It's wallpaper at this point. It's so familiar, so embedded in the visual language of the show, that most viewers stopped seeing it years ago. It's just there, the way mountains are just there or the ocean is just there. Part of the scenery, part of the background, not something you look at. But here's the thing. The show has been asking you to look at it for 36 years. Quietly, patiently, episode after episode, the evidence has been stacking up in plain sight, waiting for someone to stop treating it as background detail and start treating it as the central fact of Springfield's existence. And once you start doing that, once you train yourself to look directly at the plant instead of past it, you realize that almost everything strange and dark and inexplicable about this show traces back to the same source. The same cracked cooling towers, the same leaking waste, the same invisible contamination spreading through the water table and the air and the food supply of an entire town. The Springfield nuclear power plant isn't just part of the show. It's the engine the show runs on. And the people living in its shadow are not quirky cartoon characters with a fun art style. They are, if you take the show's own evidence seriously, a contaminated population showing the symptoms of decades of unregulated nuclear exposure. And the most terrifying part of that theory is how much evidence the show gives you to support it, hiding in plain sight across more than 700 episodes. So, let's lay it out properly. Let's take it from the beginning and build the case the way the show builds it, one quiet detail at a time, until the picture becomes impossible to look away from. The plant is owned by Charles Montgomery Burns. He's a billionaire of indeterminate but extreme age who has been the wealthiest and most powerful man in Springfield for as long as anyone can remember. The facility is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor, which sounds technical and official, and it is. But what matters more than its technical classification is its safety record, which is, by any reasonable measurement, catastrophic. A government safety inspection found 342 separate violations at the plant. 342. The estimated cost of bringing the facility up to legal operating standards was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. Not because the money wasn't available. Burns is wealthy many times over, and $56 million, while substantial, would not have significantly diminished his fortune. He refused because fixing the violations would mean acknowledging they existed. And acknowledging they existed would mean someone might start asking questions about what those violations had already done to the town. The violations themselves are worth sitting with for a moment, because the show lists them casually, treating them like background comedy, when they are actually describing an environmental catastrophe in progress. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into local waterways. Radioactive waste being disposed of on children's playgrounds. Plutonium used as a paperweight on an employee's desk. Cooling towers patched with chewing gum rather than repaired with proper materials. Rodents in the facility emitting visible radiation, their bodies glowing from the exposure. And then there's the one the show drops most quietly of all. The one that most viewers register only dimly before the scene moves on. Human skeletons in the basement. The bones of people, never identified, never explained, sitting in the lower levels of an active nuclear facility while the plant continues to operate around them. Nobody investigates. Nobody asks who those people were or how they came to be dead inside a working reactor. The show just shows you the bones, and Springfield moves on. Now think about who is responsible for ensuring none of this happens. The safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant, the man whose literal job is to stand between the reactor and the surrounding population and say no when something is wrong, is Homer Simpson. The show's own creator, Matt Groening, has stated on record that Homer has an IQ of 55. In a later episode, Homer discovers that a crayon has been lodged in his brain since early childhood, physically blocking a portion of his neural pathways and suppressing his cognitive function to a degree that qualifies as a clinical disability. This is the man monitoring the safety systems of a nuclear reactor. He sleeps at his workstation routinely. He has been shown eating donuts during active meltdown warnings. In one episode, he threw a pastry into the reactor core to see whether it would grow larger from the radiation. That is the person standing between Springfield and a nuclear catastrophe, and he has been standing there, failing at that job for over 30 years. The first visible mutation in Springfield appears in Season 2. Blinky is a fish pulled from a river near the power plant, and Blinky has 3 eyes, not 2, 3. It becomes national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as a campaign centerpiece, arguing that Burns is poisoning the local environment. Burns is eventually forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it's harmless. He takes a bite, the town watches, and then Springfield collectively shrugs and moves on. No water testing is ordered. No environmental study is commissioned. Nobody says what should be the most obvious thing anyone has ever said, which is that if the fish living in the water are developing extra organs, something is happening to the people drinking the same water. That question, the one Springfield refuses to ask, has an answer the show began building toward in Season 8. The episode is called The Springfield Files, and it starts when Homer spots what he believes is an alien in the woods near town. The whole of Springfield panics. FBI agents are called in. The episode builds toward a dramatic reveal, the kind of climactic moment where the truth is finally going to be unveiled and everything is going to snap into focus. And when the truth comes out, it's not an alien. It's Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so extreme, so saturated with chemicals and radiation, that his body has begun to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without it, he dies. After each session, Burns wanders out of the medical facility in a dazed, euphoric state, stumbling through the woods, glowing in the dark, and the people of Springfield see this luminous figure moving through the trees, and their first instinct is that it must be a visitor from outer space. Not radiation, not the power plant that dominates their skyline and employs half the town. An alien? That's where their minds go. That's the depth of the denial. And in the Simpsons movie, the accumulated weight of Springfield's environmental contamination becomes impossible to ignore even within the show's own universe. The EPA, a real federal agency operating within the story, determines that Springfield has become so toxic, so fundamentally contaminated, that the only viable solution is physical containment. They lower a glass dome over the entire town to prevent Springfield's pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. The United States government looks at this one small town and concludes that it is an environmental hazard on a national scale. The people inside, every resident who has spent decades drinking that water and breathing that air and living in the shadow of those cracked towers, are sealed inside the dome when it goes up. Now look at the residents themselves. Really look. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that defies normal human biology. His overbite is severe. His eyes bulge in a way that suggests thyroid abnormality or fluid pressure behind the orbital socket. He has 4 fingers on each hand. His IQ places him in a range typically associated with severe cognitive disability. And his body absorbs trauma that should be fatal, with an ease that suggests something fundamentally different is happening at a cellular level. Homer has been shot, electrocuted, fallen from significant heights, been struck by vehicles and survived explosions. His healing rate is extraordinary. His pain tolerance is beyond what any clinical study of human physiology would predict. He has spent his entire adult life working in direct proximity to an active nuclear reactor, and he is, in almost every measurable biological way, not quite what a human being is supposed to look like. Marge Simpson has the same bulging eyes, the same 4-fingered hands. Her hair grows straight upward in a tower that has maintained the exact same shape for 36 years without any visible structural support. She was briefly employed at the plant herself, exposed to the same environment, the same violations, the same radioactive leakage, and all 3 of her children were born after both parents had already been absorbing Springfield's contaminated environment for years. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie all display physical characteristics that do not appear in normal human populations. The self-maintaining spiky hair, the pronounced overbites, the eyes that sit slightly too large and too far forward in the face, the yellow skin that covers every single resident of Springfield without exception, a pigmentation anomaly that appears in no other town, no other population, nowhere else in the show's universe. That last detail is the one that makes the radiation theory click into place most firmly. When guest characters visit Springfield, when celebrities appear or people arrive from outside the town, they look different. Their proportions are closer to normal human anatomy. Their eyes are a more natural size. Their features don't have the same pronounced distortions that mark Springfield's permanent residents. The show draws outsiders with more realistic proportions than it draws the people who live there. And the standard explanation, the one everyone accepts without examining, is that this is just the art style. This is just how The Simpsons looks. But within the show's own internal logic, there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live inside Springfield and people who come from outside it. The people inside the contamination zone look mutated. The people outside it look like normal human beings. Even the family dog shows the same distortions in eye size and body proportion that mark his owners. Blinky the fish has a third eye. The show has told you directly, with one of its most memorable images, that the radiation from the power plant is producing visible, physical mutations in the living organisms that inhabit Springfield's environment. And then it expects you to believe that somehow, uniquely, the human beings living in that same environment have been untouched. Burns has always known. The show makes this explicit across multiple episodes if you're paying attention. Burns funds private medical research. He employs personal physicians. He undergoes weekly treatments that manage what amounts to chronic radiation poisoning in his own body. Burns understands radiation biology better than anyone else in Springfield because his survival literally depends on that understanding. He has an entire pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of synthesizing experimental treatments. He knows what his plant is doing to Springfield's population because he is personally experiencing, in a controlled and medicated form, what uncontrolled radiation exposure does to a biological system. And Homer's continued employment at the plant, despite his catastrophic incompetence, is not an oversight. It's not negligence on Burns's part. It's strategy. When a group of German investors briefly purchased the plant, the first thing they did was fire Homer and conduct a thorough safety assessment. The cost of bringing the facility up to code nearly bankrupted them. Burns bought the plant back and rehired Homer immediately. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down within days. Homer ensures the violations continue indefinitely. The radiation keeps leaking, the water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his absolute monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and through both of those things, its people. A population whose critical thinking, the show suggests, has been steadily eroded by decades of exposure to the same poison that's given their fish an extra eye. There's a detail in season 12 that adds another layer to this. Homer has the crayon removed from his brain. His IQ skyrockets. He becomes intelligent, perceptive, articulate, capable of understanding the world around him in ways he never has been. And it makes him profoundly miserable. He sees Springfield clearly for the first time. He sees his job for what it is. He sees the gap between what his life is and what it could have been. He sees Burns. He sees the plant. He understands the architecture of his own situation with painful clarity. And it's unbearable. So he has the crayon put back in. He chooses the fog. He chooses the comfortable stupidity over the devastating clarity. But the show never asks the question that should follow immediately from this revelation. How did a crayon end up lodged inside a child's brain in the first place? Homer grew up in Springfield. He was seen by Springfield doctors throughout his childhood and adolescence. He received medical care as an adult. Not one physician, across all those years, found a foreign object in his skull. Either Springfield's medical community is so comprehensively incompetent that they missed a crayon-sized object in a patient's brain across decades of routine care, or someone in the medical establishment knew it was there and chose not to remove it. And if Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare infrastructure, if the doctors in this town have been looking the other way while the radiation does its work on their patients, then Homer's crayon is not just a bizarre physical accident. It is the show using a very specific image to tell you something it cannot say directly. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains. Something that keeps them compliant and incurious and unable to look up at those cracked cooling towers and ask the simplest, most human question available to them. Why are we all like this? The radiation theory, once you've assembled it fully, does something remarkable. It doesn't explain one mystery about the show, it explains essentially all of them. The characters don't age because their biology has been altered at a cellular level by decades of nuclear contamination, a mutation that among its many effects has disrupted normal cellular aging. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's memory and critical thinking functions are compromised by chronic neurological damage, the same damage that prevents them from questioning Blinky the fish or the skeletons in the basement or the man who glows in the dark. Homer survives things that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that have made him remarkably durable physically while devastating him cognitively. Burns stays alive through treatments that would destroy a normal human because he has spent a century developing the infrastructure to manage his own radiation exposure with resources that no one else in Springfield has access to. And nobody in Springfield questions any of it because the same poison that gave their fish a third eye damaged the part of their brains that would have noticed. Springfield isn't a quirky animated town. It's a contamination zone. The residents aren't eccentric characters in a long-running comedy. They are symptomatic. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every impossible recovery, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset, every unexplained phenomenon traces back to the same source. The cracked cooling tower leaking the same invisible contamination into the same water supply, feeding the same damaged population that can't figure out why their children have 4 fingers, and their elderly neighbor seems to be about 30 years older than his stated age. The plant isn't just part of the show. The plant is the show, and the people inside it will never figure that out because the plant already made sure they can't. If you're still awake and enjoying this, drop a comment below and tell me what time it is and where you're watching from. It genuinely helps, and I love knowing where this is reaching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good moment. There's a lot more Springfield ahead. Number. Section 2. Homer's Coma and the Dream That Never Ended. Now we're going to take everything you just heard about Springfield, the contamination, the mutations, the careful architecture of the town's dysfunction, and we're going to reframe it entirely. Because there's a theory that doesn't contradict the radiation explanation. It contains it. It takes the radiation theory and tucks it inside a larger, darker, more emotionally devastating idea. And once you hear it, it has a way of sitting with you long after the episode ends. What if everything that happens in The Simpsons after a specific date in April of 1993 is a dream? Not a metaphorical dream, not a creative interpretation, a literal dream, being generated in real time by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, his brain slowly dimming, his family somewhere nearby, waiting for him to open his eyes. Let's go back to where it starts. The 1st of April 1993. The 18th episode of Season 4. The episode is called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise is simple enough. Bart is running April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one escalating beyond the last, until he takes one of Homer's cans of beer to an industrial auto shop and places it in a paint shaker. When Homer opens the can, the explosion is so violent that it sends him to the hospital. While he's lying in his hospital bed recovering, he notices a candy vending machine across the room. He gets up to get something. The machine tips forward. It lands on Homer with enough force that he flatlines. He enters a genuine, medically induced coma. This is not a cutaway gag. It's not a dream sequence. Homer Simpson clinically dies and enters an unconscious state that lasts for 7 weeks. The episode ends with what appears to be a resolution. Bart weeps at Homer's bedside and confesses that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately starts strangling his son. The family laughs, the audience laughs. Homer laughs too, even though he says he doesn't understand why he's laughing. Everything seems to go back to normal. The show tells you Homer woke up, and most viewers accept this and move on. But in the final moments of that same episode, before the credits roll, the show tells you something else. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5% gone permanently, destroyed, never coming back. Homer's response to learning he has sustained irreversible brain damage is to laugh without knowing why. The family finds this charming. And then the episode ends, and The Simpsons continues for 32 more years as though nothing happened. Unless nothing did happen. Unless the moment Homer appeared to wake up was not a waking at all, but the first image of the dream. The Homer coma theory is the most discussed, most analyzed, most internally consistent fan theory in the entire history of The Simpsons. Its basic premise is straightforward. Homer Simpson did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every impossible event, every guest appearance, every escalating absurdity is a dream. It is a dream being generated by the mind of a man lying perfectly still in a hospital bed, his brain producing images and stories and a version of his family while the real world moves forward outside the room he's in. The evidence for this theory is the kind that accumulates quietly and then hits you all at once. Start with the most obvious thing. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show, not realistic in any documentary sense. It was always a cartoon, always heightened, always satirical, but the storylines dealt with recognizable human problems. Homer tries to stop drinking and struggles with the withdrawal. Marge develops feelings for another man and has to examine what her marriage means. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher who actually engages with her intelligence. Bart faces the possibility of being held back a year in school and has to reckon with the consequences of not trying. These are domestic stories. The emotional stakes are human-sized. The problems are the kind real families argue about at kitchen tables and lie awake thinking about at night. Financial stress, marital strain, academic failure, questions about identity and purpose and whether the life you're living is the life you wanted. The show's comedy was built on the gap between the Simpsons' aspirations and their reality, which is a gap that every family understands. After the coma, the show transforms. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante street patrol. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers his mother, who he believed was dead, is actually a fugitive radical living off the grid. Homer meets God on 2 separate occasions, and both encounters are treated as moderately significant. The show goes, over the course of several seasons, from a family sitcom, grounded in economic anxiety, to something closer to surrealist fantasy, where the main character has traveled to dozens of countries, worked hundreds of different jobs, met dozens of presidents and celebrities, survived physical trauma on a scale that would kill a trained soldier, and reset after every experience without retaining any meaningful change or consequence. The escalation is dramatic enough that it became a cultural conversation. For decades, fans and critics have debated when The Simpsons changed, when it stopped being the show it was in its early seasons and became something else, something louder and more cartoonish and less connected to the emotional core that made those early episodes so affecting. The coma theory has a very specific answer to that question. The Simpsons didn't change. Homer's brain got worse. The dream became less coherent over time, as the man generating it lost more and more of himself to the coma, and the increasingly surreal and consequence-free quality of later seasons is the faithful depiction of a mind that is slowly, quietly, irreversibly deteriorating. There's a specific detail that makes this theory genuinely unsettling, and it comes from 6 months before the coma episode. In the Season 4 premiere, an episode called Homer the Heretic, Homer has a direct conversation with God, an actual face-to-face voice of God conversation. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. He tells Homer that he will eventually understand the meaning of life, but not yet. His time is coming, God says. His time. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline fits. The language fits. God was not making a general spiritual observation about Homer's personal growth. God was telling Homer that his waking life was nearly over. And 6 months later, the vending machine fell, and everything that followed became the dream of a man who never made it back from wherever comas take you. Under this theory, the aging problem, the one that every other explanation struggles with, resolves itself completely and with a kind of quiet heartbreak. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge haven't gained a wrinkle or a gray hair. Every other theory about this, including the radiation theory, has to work hard to explain why 36 years of time have produced no physical aging in any of the show's characters. The coma theory doesn't have to work hard at all. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man who went to sleep in April 1993 and never came back. Of course, his children don't age. His dreaming brain can't imagine them growing up because he wasn't there to see it happen. His wife doesn't change because the last image his conscious mind recorded of her is the image the dream preserves. His friends, his neighbors, his coworkers, they're all fixed at the moment the vending machine fell. Because that's what comas do to the mind. They lock you in place. They freeze the world at the last moment you were actually present in it. Homer's coma dream is not running a simulation of a future he can't see. It's running a loop of the present he knew, endlessly recycled, variations on the same faces and the same house and the same family, because those are the only reference materials his unconscious mind has access to. The celebrity appearances in later seasons also make sense under this reading. Homer's coma brain is not fully isolated. It receives ambient stimulation from the world outside the hospital room, sound from the television in the ward, conversations from visitors at his bedside, music from a radio down the hall, names, voices, faces that flicker through the fog of unconsciousness. The dreaming brain intercepts these fragments and incorporates them into the dream. Every celebrity who shows up in Springfield is a voice Homer heard through the noise of the hospital, translated into a dream character by a mind trying desperately to keep the simulation populated and running. The more celebrities appear in later seasons, the more you can read it as evidence that the hospital has its television on more, or that visitors at Homer's bedside are talking more, feeding fragments of the outside world into the dream that has no other source of new material. The show itself acknowledged the theory, which is either a very gracious nod to the fan community or something more interesting. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was described as a leaked, fake, deleted scene in which Homer wakes up from a long coma, and the entire post-season 4 run of the show is revealed to have been a dream. The writers created this scene, they fully animated it, they showed it to the audience, and then they labeled it a hoax, a scene planted by hackers, not real, not canon, just kidding. But consider what that means. The writers know about the theory. They've engaged with it carefully enough to create a fully produced visual response to it. They've acknowledged that it holds together well enough to be worth addressing. And their denial came in the form of an episode that explicitly depicted Homer waking from a coma, which is precisely what the theory claims actually happened. They showed you the truth and called it a prank, and the audience laughed, the same way Homer laughed when he was told he'd permanently lost 5% of his brain. Al Jean, one of The Simpsons' executive producers, addressed the theory directly in a 2015 interview. He said it wasn't true. He dismissed it as speculation. But there are specific things Al Jean did not address in that dismissal. He didn't explain why nobody ages. He didn't explain the tonal shift that begins directly after season 4. He didn't explain the conversation between God and Homer 6 months before the coma. He didn't explain why the show becomes progressively more surreal and detached from consequence with each passing season, which is precisely the trajectory you would expect from a dream generated by a brain with diminishing capacity. He said it's not true, and the interview moved on. The fans didn't move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever managed to do. It makes the whole show make sense, all of it. Every floating timeline, every consequence-free catastrophe, every impossible recovery, every escalating absurdity, every episode that ends with things exactly as they were before, all of it resolves cleanly under the same premise. Homer is dreaming. His brain is doing the only thing it knows how to do with the life he built before the vending machine fell. It's keeping it alive. It's running the simulation of his family, in his house, on his street, and it's refusing to let the story end, because the dreaming brain of Homer Simpson understands, at whatever level dreams understand anything, that if the story ends, if the simulation finally runs out of power, then he has to face something much harder than another day at the plant. He has to find out how much time has passed, how old his children really are now, whether Marge is still at the hospital or whether she eventually had to go home and live her life, whether anyone is still sitting by his bed, or whether the room is quiet now, just the hum of machines and the soft sound of a hospital that has moved on. And maybe, the very worst possibility, not waking up at all. Here is the piece of the coma theory that stays with you. If Homer is dreaming, then the emotional core of the show changes entirely. The comedy becomes something else. Every joke, every Homer falls down, every Marge sighs, every Bart gets in trouble, every Lisa is sad because nobody listens. All of it is animated by a single, devastating, very simple wish. Homer wants his family. That's the whole dream. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, infuriating, wonderful son. He wants Lisa to have her saxophone and her idealism and her unfair, enormous brain. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold. He wants the chaos and the noise and the argument and the laughter of his house on Evergreen Terrace to last forever, and in the coma, it does. The dream gives him everything he wants. His family, preserved at the exact age he last saw them. His children, never growing up, never leaving, never becoming adults with their own lives in other cities. His wife, never older, never gone. His life, endlessly cycling through its familiar rhythms, the plant, the donut, the couch, the television, Bart, Lisa, Maggie, Marge, Marge, always Marge. Homer's coma isn't a nightmare. If the theory is true, it's the closest thing to heaven that a man like Homer Simpson would ever have the imagination to want. A house that smells like supper, children who are young forever, a wife who chose him once and, in the dream, keeps choosing him every single episode. And every time Homer survives something impossible, every time the world resets and the credits roll and everything goes back to the way it was, it's not lazy writing. It's Homer's unconscious mind refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, he has to wake up. And waking up is the one thing the dream cannot afford. Number Section 3. The real story of Mona Simpson, and what Burns took from Homer before Homer was old enough to know. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. This was the official story, the one Homer had been given, the one Abe Simpson told his son when Homer was young enough that he had no way to verify it or question it. She had died. She was gone. Homer grew up with a grave, a story, and a father who was too cold and too distant to fill the space she left. That belief shaped everything about who Homer became. His need for approval is desperate in a way that goes beyond normal human sociability. His terror of abandonment runs so deep that he will endure humiliation and degradation from his employer, rather than risk losing the only stability he has. His clinginess with Marge, his compulsive desire to be liked by everyone around him, his willingness to absorb abuse from Burns without complaint because the alternative, being without income, being without the safety net that keeps his family housed and fed, is more frightening than anything Burns has ever said to him. Homer Simpson's personality is, at its foundation, a coping mechanism built by a child whose mother disappeared. Season 7 revealed that the disappearance was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson, and it aired on the 19th of November, 1995. It is, by common consensus, one of the finest hours the show has ever produced. Not because of its jokes, though it has good ones, but because of what it reveals and what it costs. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday. When Marge insists he correct the official record, Homer goes to the Hall of Records and finds something waiting for him in the municipal database. According to the town's own records, his mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe Simpson had been using a famous writer's headstone as a prop in the story he'd invented for his son. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her dead son's grave. She doesn't recognize the grown man standing in front of her. The person she last held was 6 years old. This is a middle-aged man with a bad haircut and a work shirt, standing where a child used to be. But when Homer proves who he is, they have a reunion that is one of the most genuinely moving scenes the show has ever attempted. A man who spent 27 years believing he was unloved by his mother, and a woman who spent 27 years unable to come home. And then Mona tells him the truth. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She didn't leave because something was wrong with him. She left because staying would have put him in danger. Because the man who owned the nuclear power plant, the man Homer had been working for without knowing any of this, had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was an ordinary housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a small son named Homer. She was unremarkable in every visible way, living a quiet domestic life in Springfield while the world outside burned through protest and counterculture and generational conflict. And then something changed her. The show depicts it with the particular mixture of absurdity and sincerity that defines its best moments. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists. And their cause, the thing that transformed a housewife into a fugitive, was this. They found out that Charles Montgomery Burns was not just a nuclear power plant owner, he also owned a biological weapons laboratory. Let that settle for a moment. Burns, the man who already operates a reactor with 342 safety violations, was simultaneously running a germ warfare facility in Springfield. A laboratory designed to develop biological weapons, operating in the same town where Homer was growing up, where children played in the streets, where families lived their ordinary lives, with no knowledge that the richest man in town was synthesizing disease agents down the road. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, designed to destroy the biological agents stored there. They succeeded. The germs were gone. And then Mona made one mistake that cost her everything. As the group was fleeing, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. That someone was Mr. Burns. She helped him up. He looked at her. He saw her face. He identified her. From that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. The FBI was called. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact her husband. She couldn't explain to her son why she was leaving or when she might come back or whether she'd ever be able to come back at all. She kissed Homer while he was asleep and walked out of his life. And Homer woke up the next morning to a version of the story that would define his entire psychology. His mother was dead. He was a boy whose mother died. There must have been something about him that made her leave. This is the wound that Burns opened in Homer Simpson when Homer was 6 years old, and it never healed. Every choice Homer has made as an adult, every pathology, every coping mechanism, every desperate performance of good humor in the face of humiliation runs back to that wound. The child who woke up to find his mother gone, who was given a grave instead of an explanation, who grew up believing that love is conditional and abandonment is always waiting one mistake away. Burns knew. Not about Homer's psychology specifically, but he knew what he'd done to that family. He made a deliberate choice to pursue Mona. He used his resources, his connections, his influence with federal law enforcement to ensure she could never return. When Mona comes back to Springfield in season 7, Burns spots her through a cab window and immediately calls the authorities. The FBI shows up at the Simpson house within hours. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. And this time he understands, for the first time, who is responsible. The man who destroyed his family is the same man who signs his paycheck. Homer works for Burns. Homer has worked for Burns his entire adult life. Homer earns every dollar that feeds his children and keeps the lights on in his house from the man who stole his mother from him when he was 6 years old. And Homer, in the episode, doesn't connect these things in a way that produces action. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't quit. He doesn't even seem to fully process the relationship between the billionaire who signs his checks and the billionaire who forced his mother underground. The show plays this not as a joke but as tragedy, because Homer can't make that connection. His brain doesn't work in a way that allows him to trace the architecture of his own suffering back to its source. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of environmental contamination have damaged the cognitive pathways that would let Homer understand what has actually been done to him. And this is where the conspiracy becomes fully visible. Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away from her family when Homer was a small child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally damaged in precisely the ways that would make him the ideal employee. A man who needs approval. A man who fears abandonment. A man who will stay in a bad situation indefinitely rather than risk the uncertainty of leaving, because leaving means being alone, and being alone is the thing the 6-year-old who woke up without his mother cannot face. Homer doesn't work at the power plant because he's incapable of finding better employment. Homer works at the power plant because Burns broke him as a child. And the broken version of Homer is exactly the kind of worker Burns requires. He won't organize. He won't complain to regulators. He won't ask questions about the safety violations, or the three-eyed fish, or the skeletons in the basement. He'll show up every day, do his inadequate job, and be grateful for the paycheck. Because the alternative is the void. The show confirms this dynamic explicitly. In a later episode, it's revealed that Burns and Abe Simpson made a deal. Burns had committed a crime. Abe discovered it. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns provided a guarantee. Homer would have a job at the plant no matter what. No matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how many times he should have been terminated, no matter how spectacular his failures, Burns would keep him employed. Homer's job security, which seems on the surface like a cartoon convenience, like the show's way of keeping its central character in the same location across 700 episodes, is actually a contractual arrangement between Homer's father and his mother's persecutor, brokered in silence, never explained, never confessed to Homer, because confessing it would mean confessing everything else. Homer's mother was a radical who fought against a billionaire's biological weapons program. The billionaire retaliated by having her declared a fugitive and forcing her underground for the rest of her life. Her husband, unable to fight back, made a deal with the man who destroyed his family, trading his silence for his son's employment. His son grew up believing he was worthless and unloved, became cognitively impaired through a combination of environmental poisoning and physical brain damage, and spent his entire adult life working for the same man who did all of this to him. 3 generations of a family, broken by one man's decision to pursue a grudge because a woman helped him up after he was knocked down in his own illegal weapons lab. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The death scene doesn't reach for comedy. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the woman he barely knew, the mother who was taken from him before he was old enough to understand what he'd lost, slip away for the last time. It is one of the quietest, heaviest moments in a show that built its reputation on noise. And what makes it devastating is not the death itself, but the arithmetic. 27 years of Homer's life were lived in a wound that didn't have to exist. Every pathology, every need, every desperate reaching for love and approval that defines his character, it all traces back to a 6-year-old waking up and finding the bed empty. And the man who made that bed empty went on to become Homer's employer, his authority figure, the person whose opinion of Homer matters most in his professional life, the man who, across 36 years of episodes, cannot remember Homer's name despite Homer working for him for decades. Burns took Homer's mother. He took Homer's potential. He took Homer's ability to understand what was done to him. And then he hired the man he'd broken and put him in charge of nuclear safety, which is perhaps the darkest joke the show has ever told without labeling it as a joke. Homer was never meant to wake up in Springfield. Burns made sure of that when Homer was 6 years old and his mother disappeared in the night. Number. Section 4. Who really shot Mr. Burns? And why the official answer doesn't hold together. Before we go any further, we need to talk about the shooting. Not because the answer is straightforward. The answer is not straightforward, and the more carefully you examine it, the less straightforward it becomes. But we need to talk about it because the shooting of Charles Montgomery Burns is the single most famous mystery in the history of The Simpsons, and possibly the most famous mystery in the history of American animated television. And the official answer, the one the show committed to, the one that has been in the DVD commentary and the Wikipedia article and every fan discussion for 30 years, might be wrong. Or it might be a deliberate cover-up orchestrated by the people who were in that town hall when the gun went off. Let's go back to the beginning. Season 6, Episode 25. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. The summer of 1995. The Simpsons had never attempted anything like this before. A genuine whodunit cliffhanger. A mystery constructed with enough care and internal consistency that the show's creators genuinely believed viewers could solve it from the clues embedded in the episode. Fox promoted it like a national event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special, treating the fictional crime as an unsolved case. There was a contest, with a real prize. Viewers could submit their guesses. The winner would be animated into an actual future episode of the show. This was not a casual promotional stunt. This was a full cultural moment. And the mystery itself was legitimately constructed. Burns had gone too far, even by his own standards. He'd stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary School, gutting the budget of an already struggling institution. He'd used his financial power to bankrupt Moe's Tavern. He'd created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle. He'd injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, during one of his schemes. And for his final act, he'd built a device capable of blocking out the sun over the entire town, a mechanical disc that shut out the light so that every household in Springfield would be forced to buy their electricity from his plant. Because without sunlight, they would have no other choice. When Smithers, his lifelong assistant, protested, Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of Part 1, every single person in Springfield had a clear, documented, emotionally reasonable motive to want Burns dead. Every single one. Homer, because Burns had spent years being unable to remember his name despite Homer being his direct employee. Bart and Lisa, because the school had been gutted. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his job. Tito Puente, because the music program was cut. Moe, because his bar was driven under. Smithers, freshly fired, processing a betrayal he'd never expected from the man he'd devoted his life to. The entire town gathered at a public meeting. Multiple characters were visibly carrying weapons. The tension in the room was extraordinary. Then the shot rang out. Burns staggered. One bullet. He stumbled to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on specific letters. W and S, as read from above. M and S, as read from Burns's own perspective. The ambulance came. The screen went dark. America waited all summer. Part 2 aired in September 1995. The investigation plays out as a comedy procedural. The Springfield police, predictably, fumble through the evidence in ways that range from incompetent to actively counterproductive. Smithers confesses immediately, but his confession collapses when it becomes clear that he was blackout drunk during the relevant time and had actually fired his gun at someone else entirely. Old Jasper, in his wooden leg, wrong victim, wrong location, wrong crime entirely. Smithers is eliminated as a suspect. One by one, the obvious suspects clear themselves. Principal Skinner has an alibi. Moe has an alibi. Tito Puente has one of the more memorable alibis in television history, a full musical number establishing that he had channeled his rage into a samba rather than violence, which, honestly, is the most Springfield resolution imaginable. Then the police find something. An eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA analysis links it to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints are on the gun. His motive is the clearest of anyone in town. He's arrested. The case against him seems solid. And then Burns wakes from his coma, and he identifies his shooter. Maggie Simpson. Baby Maggie, 1 year old, sucking on a pacifier. According to Burns, he encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He tried to take her lollipop. They struggled. His gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Baby did it. No charges filed because, as Chief Wiggum notes, no jury in the world would convict a baby. Except maybe in Texas. Except the case was never actually closed. It was just stopped. Start with the contest. Fox invited viewers across America to submit guesses. Thousands entered. According to the DVD commentary, not a single person in the randomly selected sample of entries had identified the correct answer. Nobody won. The prize went to someone chosen at random from the pool, and because they had the wrong answer, they received a cash payment instead of the promised appearance in a future episode. The show's creators knew of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer to a Simpsons newsgroup online on the night of the original broadcast. But this person was using a college internet account, and by the time the contest ended and the producers tried to find them, the account was gone. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think about what this means. The show's creators designed a mystery they claimed was solvable from the clues provided. They ran a national contest around it, and when the answer was revealed, essentially no one had solved it. Either the clues were insufficient, the red herrings were too effective, or the answer didn't logically follow from the evidence the way the show had implied it would. Now, look at the clues themselves. Burns falls on the sundial. His hands point at W and S, which from his perspective becomes M and S. The show tells us this indicates Maggie Simpson. Maggie for M, Simpson for S. But Burns himself stated, on camera, after waking from his coma, that his hands pointing at those letters was not intentional. He fell. They landed where they landed. The central visual clue, the image that defined the summer-long mystery and appeared on promotional material and in news coverage, was explicitly described by the victim as a coincidence. The biggest clue in the history of the show is meaningless, according to the person it supposedly came from. Then there's the gun. Burns carried a weapon in a holster on his person. Shortly before the shooting, the holster is shown empty. The gun was already missing before the attack. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon. This narrows the suspect pool significantly. The shooter was someone who didn't bring their own weapon to the meeting, which means the shooting wasn't planned in advance, at least not by that person, because someone planning violence would have brought their own means of carrying it out. The shooter came to the meeting unarmed, encountered Burns's gun by chance, and used it impulsively. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. So do a dozen other people who weren't carrying weapons that night. Burns's last words before being shot were a recognition. Oh, it's you? Not alarm, not fear. A casual, almost relaxed acknowledgement of someone he knew. The way you'd greet someone familiar but not threatening. Now consider whether Mr. Burns knows Maggie Simpson. In any episode prior to the shooting, has Burns demonstrated any awareness of or relationship with the Simpson baby? He can't reliably identify Homer, who works for him directly and has done so for years. The idea that Burns would see an infant in a parking lot and react with the comfortable recognition of, oh, it's you, requires a relationship between them that the show has never established. In season 18, several years after the official verdict, Homer Simpson makes a casual remark, claiming that he was actually the one who shot Burns. He just says it. In conversation, almost as an aside. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the richest man in Springfield in a public context, and the show treats it as a throwaway moment that has no consequence. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is entirely possible given his character and his long history of grandiose self-narratives, or the official verdict was wrong and Homer knows it because Homer was there, because Homer is the one who pulled the trigger. And if Homer did it, then Maggie was framed. Not maliciously, not through a coordinated conspiracy, but by circumstance and convenience. The DNA evidence linked the incident to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints were on the gun. Burns woke up from a coma and pointed at a baby. A baby who can never be prosecuted, never be charged, never even fully understand what she was being accused of. The perfect resolution to an investigation that was becoming inconvenient for everyone involved. The alternate endings add another layer of doubt about the official verdict. A completely alternate conclusion was animated, fully produced, fully voiced, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. This ending was shown in a clip show special hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses it by saying it wouldn't make sense because all the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which would be, and I'm quoting directly, downright nutty. That line is itself a reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, in which a jury ignored DNA evidence in reaching an acquittal. The show is winking at you. It's telling you that ignoring DNA evidence is not an unprecedented thing. It's telling you that the official answer is not necessarily the correct one. It's telling you that evidence can be pointed in whatever direction serves the people with the power to point it. An even earlier draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers took this seriously enough to develop it. They abandoned it, but the fact that multiple credible shooters were fully developed before the final answer was chosen tells you something important. The answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted, after the fact, to support whichever answer the writers eventually committed to. The mystery was built backwards. And here is the question that nobody in Springfield ever asks, perhaps the most damning question of all. In a town where every single resident had a motive, where dozens of people were visibly carrying weapons as they walked into that town hall meeting, where the victim had just blocked out the sun and stolen the retirement savings of the elderly and bankrupted a local bar owner and destroyed a school's operating budget. In a town famously, canonically, prone to forming mobs over minor provocations, a town that has burned its own city hall down over a misunderstanding about a bear. In this town where everyone was angry enough to do something, only one shot was fired? That restraint doesn't fit what we know about Springfield. Maybe the shooting wasn't as spontaneous as the official story requires. Maybe someone with access to Burns's schedule, knowledge of his security arrangements, and enough influence to redirect the investigation toward an unchargeable suspect made a decision that night. Someone like Smithers, who knew every detail of Burns's routines and had just been fired for the first time in his life. Someone like Homer, who had finally, after years of being ignored by his own employer, reached the point where something inside him snapped. Someone like Marge, who had watched Burns systematically dismantle her children's school, injure her family's dog, and destroy the retirement security of her father-in-law, and who, for all her patience, has a capacity for quiet fury that the show has acknowledged in other contexts. The Reddit theory about Marge as the shooter is more compelling than it first appears. Burns fell in love with Marge in the episode Marge Gets a Job. This episode is part of the show's established canon. If Burns retained feelings for Marge, however inappropriately, however one-sidedly, that could explain his behavior after being shot. He woke up from a coma. He knew who had done it. He had the opportunity to identify them. And instead of naming the person responsible, he pointed at the sundial, allowed an infant to take the blame, and accepted a resolution that placed no one with any real standing in legal jeopardy. Burns did not protect Maggie out of affection for an infant he barely knew. Burns protected someone he chose not to name. The final shot of the episode shows Maggie alone in the room after everyone else has left. She looks around carefully, checking to ensure she's not being watched. Then, she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. She did it. She knows she did it. But the gesture can be read another way. Maggie is 1 year old. Babies mimic the behaviors they observe. If Maggie witnessed someone fire a gun in a parking lot, she would remember the motion. She would repeat it. The way babies repeat everything they see adults do. The gesture isn't necessarily a confession. It might be a memory. She saw someone shoot Burns, and she's replaying what she saw in the empty room, where no one is watching, because she's the only witness who will never be asked to testify. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The writers stand by it. The DVD commentary treats it as settled. But the contest nobody won. The clues Burns himself called meaningless. The alternate endings that were fully produced and nearly used. Homer's unexamined confession in season 18, and Maggie's final gesture in an empty room all suggest the same thing. The greatest mystery in the show's history was never solved. It was closed, and in Springfield, as we have been slowly discovering, those are two very different things. Number. Section 5. Mr. Burns and the Machinery of Immortality. Here's a question. The show has been circling for 36 years without ever landing on a full answer. How is Mr. Burns still alive? This isn't meant as a joke about cartoon logic. Within the established internal continuity of The Simpsons, Charles Montgomery Burns is a medical impossibility. His age has been stated, implied, and contradicted across dozens of episodes, but every version of the timeline converges on the same approximate truth. He was born somewhere in the late 1800s. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. He attended Yale. He served in World War II in a capacity the show politely describes as morally ambiguous. He has spoken about the Gilded Age not as a historical period he studied, but as a time he lived through. By the most conservative reading of the show's chronology, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the more liberal interpretations, he might be approaching 140. And he doesn't just exist, he functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with the full attention and strategic sophistication that requires. He manipulates municipal politics. He orchestrates schemes that need sustained cognitive effort, long-term planning, and working knowledge of modern finance, modern law, and modern technology. His body is frail. His physical strength is almost non-existent. A child could theoretically tip him over with sufficient determination. But his mind is sharp, precise, calculating in ways that no other character in Springfield can match. Burns is arguably the most cognitively capable person in the entire show, and he has been operating at that level of function for longer than any human being's brain should be able to sustain. The show addresses this directly in the Springfield Files. We've already talked about this episode in the context of the radiation theory, but it's worth returning to specifically for what it says about Burns's survival. He undergoes a weekly medical treatment so extreme, so saturated with radiation and experimental compounds, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly one more week. Without it, he dies. The margin for error is zero. Miss one appointment and Burns's body, held together by whatever this treatment does to his cellular architecture, begins to fail. His life is maintained the way you maintain a machine through scheduled servicing. Not healed. Not treated for any specific illness. Serviced. Like a reactor. And the treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's water supply for decades, whose industrial practices have produced mutated fish and glowing rodents, and possibly much worse, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to keep his own biological systems running. Burns isn't simply profiting from radiation, he's powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by a century or more of proximity to nuclear material that it can no longer sustain itself through normal cellular processes. He requires external radiation input the way healthy bodies require food and oxygen. Take it away and his systems collapse within a week. This explains something the show has depicted multiple times without fully examining. Burns's immune system, or rather the spectacular, medically bewildering failure of it. In one of the series' most quoted scenes, Burns visits a doctor who informs him that he has every disease known to medical science simultaneously present in his body. Every single one. The doctor explains that these diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium, each one blocking the others from progressing. It's like, the doctor says, 3 people trying to fit through a doorway at once. The gridlock prevents any single illness from advancing. Burns is the sickest man in the United States, functionally indestructible, because everything that should kill him is being held back by everything else that should kill him. The show plays this for absurdist comedy, but if you accept the radiation framework, it becomes something stranger and more coherent than a joke. Burns's weekly treatments don't cure his diseases, they manage them. They keep the biological gridlock in perfect stasis, every illness balanced against every other illness, the equilibrium maintained with the same precision that a nuclear engineer uses to manage a reactor's control rods. Burns's body is a reactor. His weekly treatments are the control rods. Allow them to be removed, allow the careful balance to be disrupted, and everything surges forward at once. This is not medicine in any conventional sense. This is nuclear maintenance applied to a human body. And Burns is the only person in Springfield who has access to the infrastructure, financial and scientific and logistical, needed to perform it. Smithers's role becomes much clearer under this reading. He is not simply a devoted personal assistant. He is the single most important operational component of Burns's survival system. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every weekly treatment appointment without exception. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with an attention that has always seemed, to outside observers, to border on obsession, but that makes complete sense if Smithers understands that missing a single appointment is a death sentence. Smithers is not devoted to Burns out of love alone, though the show suggests that complicating layer of feeling as well. Smithers is devoted because he knows, in a way that no one else in Springfield fully grasps, that his absence would kill Burns within days. Their relationship, which the show has always framed primarily in terms of emotional dependency and unrequited feeling, has a mechanical foundation underneath all of that. Smithers knows how the system works. He is the person who keeps the system working. And Burns, for all his cruelty and contempt toward essentially every other human being in his life, treats Smithers with a specific kind of tolerance that he offers no one else. Because Smithers is not replaceable. Not with money and not with power. You cannot hire someone to keep Burns alive. You can only work with the person who already knows how to do it and has demonstrated a willingness to keep doing it indefinitely. Burns's connection to historical events layers another dimension onto the immortality question. The show has depicted Burns interacting with, referencing, or demonstrating personal knowledge of an extraordinary range of historical moments. He knew Howard Hughes. He attended Yale at a time when the institution was educating people who are now in historical textbooks. He served in World War II in a role the show deliberately leaves vague, though it includes a reference to a $1 trillion bill he stole from the United States government during wartime and kept hidden for decades. He has described the Gilded Age not as something he learned about in school, but as a period he experienced, something that happened while he was present, while he was already accumulating the wealth and connections that would eventually become his empire. And the Burns family itself, the dynasty he represents rather than simply the man, extends further back than Charles Montgomery Burns himself. The show depicts the Burns lineage as one of the oldest and most continuously powerful in American history. This is wealth that predates the Industrial Revolution, influence that has been maintained across generations, not handed down in the normal way of legacies and inheritances and gradual dispersal, but preserved, kept intact, extended rather than diluted across the passage of time. That kind of generational continuity is not what happens when old money passes through normal human lifespans from father to son to grandson. That requires either extraordinary luck, extraordinary management, or something more deliberate. The question the show never answers is whether Charles Montgomery Burns is unique, or whether his family has always found ways to extend the lifespans of its patriarchs beyond what normal biology allows. If the current Burns has survived to well over 100 through artificial means, through the specific application of radiation therapy and experimental medicine, and a logistical apparatus built to ensure his survival continues, did previous Burns patriarchs do something similar with the tools available to them? Before nuclear radiation, before modern medicine, before the technologies that currently keep Charles Burns alive, what methods did earlier members of the dynasty use to maintain their hold on their fortune and their power? The show doesn't answer this. It doesn't need to. It only needs to establish that the Burns family has been in continuous control of their resources for longer than most American institutions have existed, and to let you draw your own conclusions about what maintaining that kind of continuity requires. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show's history. He's been shot by Maggie, hospitalized dozens of times, collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been poisoned, been abandoned in the wilderness without resources. And every time, he comes back. Not through the passive cartoon resilience that Homer exhibits, where the show simply requires him to survive, and so he does. Burns survives through infrastructure, through money, through the machinery of wealth that has spent a century organizing itself around one primary purpose, ensuring that regardless of what happens to Burns's physical body, there will always be a doctor available, always a treatment ready, always a Smithers standing by with the necessary logistics to pull him back from whatever edge he's fallen over. Homer's survival is passive. Burns's survival is engineered. Every dollar Burns has spent, every institution he has compromised, every politician he has purchased, every scientist whose research he has funded, and every doctor whose loyalty he has secured over more than a century of deliberate, calculated accumulation, it all serves the same ultimate function: keep Burns alive, keep the treatments running, keep the disease equilibrium balanced, keep the reactor from going critical. And here's the part that makes the Burns immortality theory something more than just an explanation for a strange character's longevity. Springfield needs Burns to survive. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns's ownership and management. Burns's survival depends on his wealth. His wealth depends on the power plant's continued operation. It's a closed loop, a self-sustaining system in which the man and the machine and the money all feed each other in a cycle that has no natural ending point. Springfield cannot destroy Burns because Springfield would not survive destroying Burns. The jobs, the electricity, the entire economic infrastructure of the town, it all runs through him. Burns cannot die because dying would mean the system he built would finally have to face what it's done to the people it's been built on top of. The contaminated water, the mutated fish, the cognitive damage, the 3 generations of Simpsons broken by one man's decisions. All of that accountability, deferred for decades, would have nowhere left to be deferred to if Burns were gone. He is the oldest man in Springfield. He might be the oldest man in America. He is kept alive by radiation treatments, sustained by a fortune older than the nation itself, protected by an assistant whose devotion is a medical necessity, and surrounded by a population too damaged by his own plant's runoff to ask why their employer has personal memories of the Spanish-American War. He's not immortal in any mystical sense. He's something more mundane and more frightening than that. He's too expensive to die, and Springfield will keep paying that cost for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, if the treatment schedule holds, could be a very long time indeed. Number. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the quietest danger in Springfield. Maggie Simpson does not speak. She does not walk reliably. She communicates through pacifier sounds and the occasional pointed, ancient stare. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years, and in that time, without saying a single word beyond the one she spoke once, as a baby, in a voice provided by Elizabeth Taylor as a cameo that was never repeated, she has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot a billionaire. She led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker and won. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations using problem-solving skills that exceed what any developmental psychology framework would predict for her age. She was tested for intelligence, and the results were, depending on which episode you're watching, either extraordinary or literally off the top of the scale. She has demonstrated memory, strategic thinking, delayed gratification, situational awareness, and the capacity to keep secrets across a 36-year period. And she has done all of this while maintaining the most effective disguise available to any person in Springfield. She has convinced everyone around her that she is just a baby. Let's start with the shooting. Not because it's the most interesting thing about Maggie, but because it's the most famous, and we need to establish the foundation before we examine what was built on top of it. We've already gone through the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery in detail, and examined the reasons why the official answer is less airtight than the show wants you to believe. But whether or not Maggie intentionally pulled that trigger, the aftermath reveals something important about how she operates. A baby was officially identified as the person who shot the richest man in town. An investigation was conducted, evidence was examined, and the conclusion was that yes, this infant had committed an act of violence against an adult, and there was nothing the legal system could do about it. Chief Wiggum's own words: "No jury in the world would convict a baby." And that's where it ended. Case closed, Maggie goes home, everyone moves on, but the final shot of that episode is worth sitting with more carefully than most viewers have. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around, deliberately, scanning the space to confirm that she is unobserved. Then she moves her pacifier in a motion that specifically mimics the pulling of a trigger. The show frames this as a confession. She did it. She knows she did it. And now that no one is watching, she's acknowledging it to herself in the private language of gesture. But there's another way to read this, and it's a way that opens into something much larger. That sequence of actions, check surroundings, confirm isolation, then reproduce a specific physical gesture from memory, requires several things that are not typically associated with infants. It requires situational awareness. It requires the memory of a specific physical act. It requires an understanding that performing this gesture in the presence of others would be inadvisable. And it requires the impulse control to wait until alone before doing it. These are not baby behaviors. These are the behaviors of someone who understands the difference between what is safe to do in public and what should be done only in private. Someone who has a concept of surveillance and consequence. Someone who is, in other words, thinking strategically. Now look at The Longest Daycare. This is a theatrical short film released in 2012, 7 minutes long, nominated for an Academy Award, and it is the most sustained single piece of evidence for the Maggie theory that the show has ever produced. The premise is simple. Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare center run with authoritarian efficiency, and she encounters a caterpillar she wants to protect from another baby who wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature heist film. Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's security systems through a sustained process of observation, planning, improvisation, and adaptive problem-solving that would be impressive in a trained adult. She reads the environment, she identifies the threats, ranks them by urgency, and develops responses to each of them in sequence. She executes multi-step plans that require spatial awareness, timing, and the ability to predict the behavior of other individuals. She encounters unexpected complications and revises her approach in real time without losing progress toward her goal. She succeeds, the butterfly is saved and released, and she does all of this while being physically limited to the motor capabilities of a 1-year-old body. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls when she should be running. But her decision-making is, throughout, flawless. Every choice she makes is optimized. Every problem she encounters is solved through cognitive means rather than physical ones, because her cognitive capacity is extraordinary, and her physical capacity is that of a baby. She is operating at a cognitive level that her body simply cannot keep up with. And she succeeds anyway, because she has learned to work within her physical constraints and compensate for them through superior thinking. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly on multiple occasions. The results vary by episode, because the show treats this as a recurring comedy beat rather than a continuous thread, but the pattern is consistent. Maggie consistently demonstrates cognitive abilities that no 1-year-old should possess, and the family consistently fails to notice, because there's always another Homer disaster or Bart prank or Lisa crusade absorbing everyone's attention, and nobody is watching the baby carefully enough to see what the baby is actually doing. And that, precisely that, is the whole point. Maggie's defining characteristic is not her intelligence. Every brilliant person in Springfield is ultimately limited by the fact that their brilliance is visible. Lisa Simpson is extraordinarily intelligent. Everyone knows it. And what has that gotten her? Isolation, dismissal, a lifetime of being the smartest person in the room and being ignored by the room anyway. Lisa announces herself as the most capable person present everywhere she goes, and the world of Springfield responds by confirming that capability and then doing nothing about it. She is right about almost everything, and it changes almost nothing. Her intelligence is her most prominent feature, and it is, in the social ecology of Springfield, a vulnerability as much as a gift. Maggie watched this happen. From infancy, in the household she shares with Lisa, Maggie has had a front-row seat to the complete story of what happens to an intelligent woman who makes her intelligence visible in this environment. She has watched her sister fight every day for recognition and receive resistance. She has watched the family's most capable member be repeatedly undervalued by both the household and the community. She has observed, with the patience of someone who has nowhere else to be and nothing else to do, the full social mechanics of how Springfield treats people who announce what they're capable of. And she made a different choice. Silence is armor. Invisibility is power. The less she is noticed, the more she can do. The lower the expectations placed on her, the more space she has to operate in. If everyone in Springfield expects a baby, she can be anything she wants, and they won't see it until it's too late to matter. Think about every time Maggie has done something remarkable and ask yourself what happened afterward. The answer is almost always the same: nothing. The family doesn't notice. The community doesn't notice. The incident is absorbed into the background noise of Springfield and forgotten by the next episode. Burns was shot and the investigation focused on Homer and Smithers and everyone except the baby, because who suspects a baby? The daycare rebellion succeeded because infants are not monitored carefully enough to be caught organizing. Every heroic act, every display of exceptional problem-solving, every moment where Maggie makes a decisive difference to her family's safety or well-being, it happens below the radar, in the margins, in the spaces between events that other characters are generating. And Maggie ensures those margins stay available to her by maintaining the disguise. She continues performing helplessness. She continues performing passivity. She continues being, to all outward appearances, exactly what everyone expects a one-year-old to be: quiet, dependent, unremarkable, easily overlooked. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of all of them. Now connect this to the radiation theory. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces mutations, and if those mutations vary by individual, then Maggie represents the extreme opposite of Homer on the cognitive spectrum. Homer's mutation, the radiation damage, the combination of environmental exposure and the crayon, has reduced his cognitive function to a level that qualifies as disability. Maggie's mutation has amplified her cognitive function to a level that standardized testing cannot fully accommodate. Same environment, same family, same water and air and years of living in the shadow of those cooling towers. The father's brain was diminished, the daughter's was supercharged. They are two endpoints of the same process, the evidence of what uncontrolled radiation exposure does when it produces variation rather than consistent damage. Homer and Maggie are two sides of the same radioactive equation. And if the coma theory is also true, Maggie's extraordinary nature takes on a different kind of meaning. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since 1993 is his unconscious mind's simulation of the family he loves, then Maggie's genius is Homer's hope. He cannot see her grow up. He cannot watch her develop. He cannot know what she becomes. He cannot hear her speak beyond that one word she said while he was conscious. So, in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her limitations. He makes her capable, quietly capable, secretly capable, safe in ways that have nothing to do with being protected by anyone else and everything to do with the extraordinary mind he has dreamed into the smallest member of his family. Maggie's genius in this reading is not a mutation, it's a father's prayer. His deepest unconscious wish that his youngest child will be okay, will be more than okay, will be so completely, quietly, devastatingly capable that nothing Springfield can throw at her will be enough to stop her. Back in Springfield, though, in the world where the radiation is real and the coma is speculation, there is one more dimension to Maggie's silence that the show has never fully addressed. She's been watching. For 36 years, from inside the family that sits at the center of every major event in Springfield's modern history, she has been watching everything. She has watched Burns operate. She has watched the political system be manipulated. She has watched the community forget its disasters and vote to suppress its truths and exile anyone who insists on the inconvenient version of events. She has watched Homer fail to understand his own situation. She has watched Lisa exhaust herself trying to change a town that is structurally designed to resist change. And she is waiting. The show never tells us for what. Maggie's endgame, the eventual point of all this silent observation and careful accumulation, is the last truly open mystery in the Simpson family. She's the only character whose future remains genuinely unknown, because the show has never committed to revealing what she's actually capable of at full capacity. We've seen glimpses. She shot a billionaire and was never charged. She commanded a room full of babies through some combination of presence and communication that the show doesn't explain. She has solved problems that stump adults. She has assessed situations faster than trained professionals. She has confirmed or denied facts with a single nod in ways that her family has learned to trust implicitly. She is 1 year old. She cannot reliably walk. She cannot speak in any sustained way. She is, by every external measure, the most helpless and dependent member of her family. And she is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace. She just hasn't decided what to do about it yet. And maybe that's the scariest thing. Not what Maggie has already done, impressive as the evidence for that is. What she's waiting for. Behind the pacifier, behind those large dark eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate, chosen, strategic silence, something extraordinary is thinking. Something is planning. Something is watching the family and the town and the invisible structures of power that govern both, with the patience and the intelligence of someone who knows that timing is everything and who is willing to wait as long as necessary for the moment to be right. When Maggie finally speaks, when she finally decides the time has come to let Springfield see what's been behind the baby face this whole time, no one will be ready. No one will be expecting it. No one will even be looking in the right direction, because that's exactly how she designed it. Number. Section 7. The Principal and the Pauper, and Springfield's Architecture of Forgetting. There is one episode of The Simpsons that the fanbase has never fully forgiven. It is, by common critical consensus, one of the worst hours the show has ever produced, and fans have spent more than 2 decades citing it as evidence that the writers stopped caring about the show's continuity, that the rules were being discarded without respect for the audience, that something fundamental had broken in the relationship between the story and its viewers. The episode is The Principal and the Pauper, Season 9, Episode 2. It aired on the 28th of September, 1997. And I want to make the case that this episode is not bad writing. It is the most honest piece of writing the show has ever done. It just says something the audience found profoundly uncomfortable, which is that Springfield has never operated the way you thought it did. And it had the audacity to show you the machinery of that reality, rather than letting it happen off-screen where you wouldn't have to look at it. Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. While the celebration is underway, a stranger enters. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, a former prisoner of war who survived captivity and eventually escaped. He came home. He found someone else living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner for 2 decades is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street criminal, a petty offender with no stable life and no real identity he valued. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian felt the weight of survivor's guilt and a responsibility he hadn't asked for. He went to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to the man's mother, Agnes. When Agnes saw him, she assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or an identity worth preserving, simply went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He lived inside that borrowed identity for 20 years. He built a career around it, a relationship with Agnes around it, a place in the community around it. And when the real Skinner walked through the door, the entire construction collapsed. The town holds a meeting. Both men are present. The truth is fully exposed. Everyone in Springfield knows that their principal is an imposter, that the man who has been running their school and living in their community under a false name has been doing so for 20 years. And then Springfield does something extraordinary. They vote, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian for identity fraud, not on whether to restore the real Skinner's identity and his place in the community. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree establishing that the imposter is, from this point forward, the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the man whose identity was stolen, the war hero who survived captivity and came home to find his life occupied by someone else, is physically removed from Springfield. He is tied to a railroad car and expelled from the town, and the judge makes it explicitly illegal, under penalty of torture, to ever mention the truth again. This is the moment the fan base rejected. The critical consensus is that this episode destroyed Skinner as a character, that it made everything the show had established about him retroactively false, that it was disrespectful to the audience's investment in a character they had spent 9 seasons caring about. But the episode is completely honest about what Springfield is. It just refuses to be indirect about it. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen the comfortable version of events over the accurate one. The town has always collectively agreed to forget whatever disrupts the narrative. The only difference between The Principal and the Pauper and every other episode where Springfield ignores a catastrophe and resets to normal is that this time you get to watch it happen. You get to see the vote. You get to watch the legal decree being issued. You get to watch the truth being physically expelled from the community on a train. Every other time it happens off-screen. Between episodes, in the space between the credits rolling and the next week's cold open. Springfield sealed itself under a glass dome, and then the dome was gone, and nobody mentioned it again. Springfield has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, and the rebuilt version always looks identical to the original and nobody asks how. Nuclear near misses, environmental catastrophes, alien encounters, the literal blocking of the sun. After every one of these events, the same reset, the same clean slate, the same fresh episode beginning in a Springfield that doesn't remember what just happened to it. The coma theory calls this a dreaming brain resetting between cycles. The radiation theory calls it cognitive damage from chronic neurological exposure. But the principal and the pauper offers a third explanation that doesn't require any mystical or biological mechanism. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset. Collectively, deliberately, through a social contract so deeply embedded in the community's functioning that it doesn't need to be written down or voted on, except in the one case where the show decided to make the contract visible. The contract says this: we will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed version of reality. We will treat the lie as truth and the truth as criminal, and anyone who insists on the inconvenient version of events will be removed from our community. That's not a cartoon convention. That's a description of how real communities function. Small towns in particular have a capacity for collective denial that can be terrifying when you examine it closely. Scandals are buried, crimes are forgotten, uncomfortable truths are gradually replaced by more comfortable narratives until the revised version is the only one anyone can remember. The people who insist on the original version are eventually excluded, explicitly or through social pressure, from the community that has decided it prefers not to know. Springfield doesn't forget because its residents are cognitively incapable of remembering. Springfield forgets because remembering is dangerous. If the town remembered the dome, it would have to acknowledge the pollution. Acknowledging the pollution means confronting the power plant. Confronting the plant means challenging Burns. Challenging Burns means the economy collapses. And if the economy collapses, the town dies. So the town forgets. It votes to forget. It makes forgetting a legal requirement. And it exiles anyone who can't stop remembering. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's most important warning sign. He was a man who arrived carrying proof that the official version of a story was false, that the person the community had built a relationship with was not who they believed him to be. And Springfield's response was not to thank him for the truth, or to grieve the deception, or to work through the complicated feelings that reality sometimes requires. Its response was to criminalize the truth and expel the messenger. That's not bad writing. That's a diagnosis. The show is telling you exactly how Springfield maintains its impossible, internally contradictory, serially catastrophic reality. Through consensus, through denial, through the systematic exclusion of anyone who points at the thing the community has decided not to see. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. And the real Seymour Skinner is somewhere outside the town's borders, expelled from his own name, exiled from the life that was supposed to be his, the last honest man in a community that made honesty a punishable offense. If the coma theory is also true, this episode takes on one more layer of meaning. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire community votes to sustain a lie, because it needs to believe that lies can be maintained indefinitely, that a borrowed identity can become a real one through collective agreement, that the fake version of a life can replace the true version, and if everyone agrees to treat it as real, then it becomes real, and no one has to deal with the gap between what is and what was. Because that's what Homer's coma is, a false life, maintained by the agreement of his unconscious mind to keep it running, a dream pretending to be waking. And the dream needs to believe that this pretense is sustainable, that the story can keep going indefinitely, that no one will come through the door demanding the real version. Springfield votes to keep Tamzarian. Homer's brain votes to keep the dream. The Principal and the Pauper is the most important episode the show has ever made, because it's the only one that showed you the machinery. The process by which Springfield maintains its reality against the pressure of actual events. The mechanism that makes every reset possible, every catastrophe forgettable, every impossible thing sustainable. The social contract that allows a town of people with 4 fingers and yellow skin and 3-eyed fish and a billionaire who glows in the dark to continue describing itself as a normal American community. It's not that the episode broke something. The episode revealed what was always there, under every reset, behind every forgotten catastrophe. The episode was the one moment the curtain was pulled back and the audience saw the stage machinery and didn't like what it revealed. Armin Tamzarian is Seymour Skinner. Springfield has decreed it. And anyone who says otherwise gets put on a train. Number. Section 8. Where is Springfield and why it can never be found? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can identify Springfield than can name the capital of more than half the actual states in the country. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire that has been burning for decades, a gorge, a harbor, a monorail, an elementary school, a prison, 2 hospitals, a zoo, and a quickie mart. It has mountains and ocean access and desert terrain and farmland and old-growth forest, all within what appears to be reasonable driving distance of the town center. It has neighbors that have been identified across various episodes as Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky. It is simultaneously coastal and landlocked, northern and southern, heartland and frontier. Springfield does not exist in any state because Springfield exists in all of them at once. This is the mystery that the show's creator tried to solve in 2012. In an interview with Smithsonian Magazine, Matt Groening stated plainly that he had named the town after Springfield, Oregon. He had grown up near Springfield, Oregon. The name was chosen because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America, which suited the show's intention to be set in a town that could feel familiar to viewers from anywhere in the country. For approximately 48 hours, it seemed like the mystery had been resolved. Springfield was in Oregon, and then the show continued, making it impossible for that answer to hold. Episodes that aired after the interview place Springfield in geographic contexts that are incompatible with Oregon. The writers didn't honor the confession. They kept the contradiction alive. Because the contradiction was never an accident that needed fixing. The contradiction was always the point. The show has been deliberately, systematically, and I would argue lovingly, contradicting itself about Springfield's location for its entire run. Every time a clue appears that seems to narrow the possibilities, another clue appears in a later episode that undoes it. In one episode, the show places Springfield in the north, suggesting cold winters and proximity to Canada. In another episode, there are palm trees visible in the background, and the weather behaves like the deep south. Lisa's area code has been identified as beginning with 636, which corresponds to Missouri. The state abbreviation shown in some episodes is NT, which doesn't correspond to any actual American state. When Homer calls the state capital in one episode, the person who answers identifies the state as one beginning with a vowel, which eliminates some possibilities while keeping dozens open. The show teases answers and withdraws them. It offers partial clues and corrupts them with contradictions. It builds the mystery for a few episodes and then actively dismantles it. The Behind the Laughter episode, a mock documentary about the Simpson family that aired in season 12, finally reveals Springfield's location, sort of. In the original broadcast, the family is identified as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed. The answer depends on which version of the episode you watched, which is to say that even the show's own attempt at definitiveness contained its own undoing built into the distribution process. Now, the surface-level explanation for all of this is straightforward and has been confirmed by the show's writers. Springfield is everywhere because it's meant to be everywhere. It's designed to be the town you grew up in regardless of where you actually grew up. It's a composite of every American community that has ever existed, assembled specifically so that no viewer feels like the show is happening somewhere else. The industrial decay of the Rust Belt, the suburban sprawl of the Sun Belt, the small-town insularity of New England, the cultural blankness of the Midwest, the arid spaces of the Southwest, the humidity and heat of the South, all of it layered into one town that fits nowhere on a map precisely because it was designed to fit everywhere in the imagination. This is the official explanation. The writers have confirmed it. Groening has confirmed it. It is probably the complete and accurate account of why Springfield has no fixed location. But under the lens of the other theories we've been discussing, Springfield's geographic impossibility starts to look like something more than a design choice. If the radiation theory is correct, If the power plant has been altering the biological reality of everything in Springfield for decades, why should the effect stop at biology? The mutation has distorted the physical attributes of the town's residents. It has distorted the cognitive function of the population. Why should the physical landscape be exempt from distortion? Maybe Springfield has both mountains and ocean, because the contamination doesn't only affect living tissue. Maybe the radiation has warped the spatial relationships of the land itself, compressing geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible region. A town where physics has been bending for decades might extend that bending beyond the bodies of its inhabitants to the ground they stand on. If the coma theory is correct, Springfield's geography resolves even more cleanly. Homer's dreaming brain doesn't have a precise and accurate internal map of the United States. It has impressions, fragments of places seen and half-remembered and misremembered, and reorganized by a mind working without the benefit of external verification. Mountains from a vacation that left a strong visual memory. Ocean from a television commercial that played in the hospital room. Desert from a film. Farmland from a drive through the middle of the country. Homer's unconscious mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever experienced, layering them without regard for geographic logic, because dreams don't operate by geographic logic. Dreams operate by emotional logic. They place things near each other based on feeling rather than distance. Springfield is geographically impossible because it's assembled from Homer's feelings about America rather than his factual knowledge of American geography. And if the principle and the pauper theory is correct, if Springfield operates through collective denial and the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, then the town's refusal to have a fixed location is the ultimate expression of that denial. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot file regulatory charges against a facility if the jurisdiction keeps changing. You cannot hold anyone accountable for anything if the authority responsible for accountability is perpetually undefined. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means someone shows up with a map and a legal brief and starts asking questions about the fish and the skeletons and the cracked cooling towers and the centenarian billionaire who seems to have personal memories of wars that ended before most living Americans were born. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent EPA oversight, no permanent state attorney general in a position to run an investigation. The ambiguity isn't just a design choice. In the context of everything else we know about Springfield, it functions as a legal shield. The town remains legally ambiguous because someone, or the collective unconscious of a population that has been doing this for decades, understands that certainty is dangerous. Every state in the country has been proposed at some point as Springfield's true home. Every theory has evidence. Every theory also has contradictions. The show has maintained this perfect, deliberate, exhaustively constructed ambiguity for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. And Springfield will never be definitively located because the show made a decision long ago, whether consciously or through accumulated creative habit, that Springfield is more valuable as a mystery than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. A town that belongs to everyone cannot be shut down. It cannot be contained or isolated or held to account or made to explain itself. It simply continues, floating between coordinates, located everywhere and nowhere, home to everyone and answerable to no one. Number. Section 9. The Simpsons predictions and the theory more interesting than prophecy. Let's talk about the predictions. You've seen them. Everyone has seen them. Screenshots from old episodes, placed next to news headlines from years or decades later, the two images sitting side by side in a way that seems to defy coincidence and demands explanation. The Simpsons predicted this. The Simpsons knew. How did they know? The most famous one is Trump. In the year 2000, the episode Bart to the Future depicted a future version of America in which Lisa Simpson serves as the country's first female president. Her predecessor, mentioned in passing as the previous occupant of the White House, is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired in the year 2000. It depicted a Trump presidency 16 years before one actually occurred. When Trump won the 2016 election, screenshots from that episode spread across every social media platform with the velocity of breaking news. People who hadn't thought about The Simpsons in 15 years were suddenly asking the same question in a dozen languages. How did they know? The list extends well beyond Trump. A 1995 episode depicted a wrist-mounted communication device that resembles a modern smartwatch. A 1994 episode put Homer in space alongside a real astronaut, decades before commercial space tourism became a functional industry. A 1998 episode contained an equation that appears to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which wouldn't be confirmed experimentally until 2012. A 1999 episode has Homer theorizing that the universe might be shaped like a donut, which intersects with subsequent cosmological research suggesting a toroidal shape for certain universal configurations. A 1993 episode depicts a flu virus originating in Asia, spreading to Springfield, causing mass panic, panic buying, and a frantic search for a cure, 27 years before COVID-19. In 1996, Homerpalooza featured a gag in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally books the London Symphony Orchestra. That exact collaboration actually happened in 2024, when Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the reality. A 1998 episode depicted the Disney Corporation acquiring 20th Century Fox as a satirical gag about media consolidation. Disney acquired 20th Century Fox in 2019. The list continues. Video calling technology, autocorrect failures, surveillance culture, robotic librarians, tablet computers, smart home devices. The show depicted all of these things before they existed as part of everyday life, sometimes years before, sometimes decades. The question everyone asks is, how? Are the writers time travelers? Is there some kind of prophetic gift embedded in the show's creative process? Is The Simpsons, as some corners of the internet have sincerely proposed, some kind of encoded document containing information about the future that its creators don't fully understand themselves? The official answer, from the people who actually make the show, is considerably less dramatic. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on The Simpsons for most of its run, addressed the prediction phenomenon directly. His explanation is blunt. If you throw enough darts, you're going to hit some bullseyes. That's it. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, observations, satirical extrapolations, and cultural references. When you generate that much content over that long a period, some portion of it will align with future events through sheer statistical probability. Not because of prophecy, because of volume. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its peak seasons, was even more direct. There are very few cases where The Simpsons predicted something, he said. It's mainly coincidence, because the episodes are so old that history repeats itself. Fact-checking organizations that have systematically examined the most widely shared prediction claims have reached the same conclusion. Most of the supposed predictions have simple, mundane explanations, and many of them look more precise in retrospect than they actually were, because the human memory of a prediction tends to sharpen and clarify when the predicted event actually occurs. The Trump prediction didn't forecast that a random celebrity might run for president. It observed that Trump had been publicly flirting with running since at least the late 1980s, had made several public statements about a potential candidacy, and represented a very specific type of celebrity to political power trajectory that the show's writers could extrapolate from existing cultural trends. They didn't predict Trump. They observed Trump was already doing this and wrote a joke about where it might logically end up. The Disney-Fox merger prediction didn't require foreknowledge of a specific deal. It required only the observation that media consolidation was an accelerating trend, and that the logical extreme of that trend was a small number of very large companies owning essentially everything. The joke writes itself from those premises. The smartwatch didn't require technological prophecy. It required only the recognition that computing devices were getting progressively smaller and more portable, and that the natural endpoint of that trajectory was something worn on the body. Wristwatch computers had been appearing in science fiction for decades before The Simpsons depicted one. The writing staff of The Simpsons has historically been among the most formally educated in American television. Multiple writers hold advanced degrees from elite universities. The staff has included people with backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, physics, political theory, and economics. These are not people guessing randomly about the future. They are highly informed observers of American culture who spend their professional lives studying trends, understanding systems, and following the logical implications of current trajectories to their absurd but structurally inevitable conclusions. That's what satire is. That's what it's always been. It's not prediction. It's attention paid to the present, extended forward a few steps. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Because while the statistical and educational explanations account for most of the predictions, they don't account for all of them. Some of the coincidences are specific enough, precise enough, detailed enough that the volume argument starts to feel insufficient. The Siegfried and Roy episode doesn't just make a vague joke about the dangers of working with wild animals. It depicts a white tiger attacking one of the performers in a way that maps specifically onto what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers. The Trump episode doesn't just predict a celebrity president. It shows Trump descending an escalator in a visual sequence that mirrors the famous moment from his 2015 campaign announcement. These are details, not just trends. And details are harder to explain through the dart-throwing theory. Which brings us to the meta theory. The one that is, I think, more interesting than any version of the prediction theory. The Simpsons doesn't predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it. Not through magic. Not through some process of esoteric influence on world events. Through culture. Through the mechanics of how ideas spread and how exposure to an idea changes the probability that the idea will eventually materialize. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced, and most culturally embedded pieces of American media ever created. It has been on the air for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its phrases have become part of the American vernacular. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand their own culture and institutions. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke doesn't disappear into the ether. It enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point. It becomes a thing people say at parties and remember when they see Trump on the news. And it gradually, subtly, changes the cultural imagination around the idea of a Trump presidency. It makes it feel less like an impossible shock and more like a punchline that has been waiting for its setup. The show didn't predict the Disney-Fox merger. It made media consolidation feel like an inevitable joke. When the merger was announced, the cultural response wasn't pure shock. It was recognition. Of course they did. We've seen this before. The Simpsons already did this bit. The joke normalized the outcome before the outcome happened. And when the outcome happened, the audience experienced it as confirmation rather than surprise. This is a real phenomenon. Cultural exposure to a scenario changes the psychological response to that scenario when it materializes. And a show that has run for 36 years, producing hundreds of satirical observations about American culture and politics and technology, has had an extraordinary amount of time to prime the cultural imagination in ways that make certain outcomes feel inevitable rather than shocking. Springfield doesn't reflect America. In this reading, America has become Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 3.5 decades, and the audience stared into it long enough that they started to resemble what they saw. The nuclear power plant owned by a corrupt billionaire who evades accountability. The local government, too, captured by special interests to function in the public interest. The population too distracted and too entertained and too economically dependent on the system that harms them to effectively resist it. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset and moving on. The collective amnesia that allows the same mistakes to repeat without consequence. The Simpsons didn't predict where America was heading. It diagnosed where America already was. And it wrote that diagnosis down in a form entertaining enough that people kept watching, kept quoting, kept sharing, while the diagnosis was busy becoming a description of their actual lives. And there is one final piece of the prediction phenomenon worth acknowledging. The thousands of jokes that didn't come true. The jetpacks that never arrived. The moon colonies that never materialized. The political outcomes that went the other way. The cultural shifts that the show anticipated and that never happened. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody shares them. Nobody builds theories around the predictions that failed because confirmation bias, the human tendency to remember the hits and forget the misses, only works in one direction. When you produce 800 episodes containing tens of thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American culture, and you filter those observations through the most powerful confirmation bias engine in history, which is the internet and social media, you end up with a highlight reel that looks exactly like prophecy. Every accurate prediction gets preserved and shared and memorialized. Every failed prediction gets absorbed into the noise and forgotten. The resulting picture is of a show with an uncanny ability to see the future, which is an illusion created by selective memory applied to an enormous archive. But here's the thing. Even knowing how the trick works, it's still impressive to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years. A writing staff that has consistently been one of the most educated and culturally attentive in American television. And enough bullseyes, even accounting for the volume and the confirmation bias, to give even the show's own creators pause. Maybe they don't predict the future, but they do something almost as interesting. They write enough possible futures, informed by deep attention to the present, that some of them inevitably materialize, and the ones that do are the only ones anyone ever asks about. Number, Section 10. Hans Moleman, the body count, and the death that keeps restarting. Hans Moleman is one of the most consistently mistreated characters in the history of American animation, and he might also be the most important one. If you've watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know him. He's the small, elderly, nearly blind man who moves through Springfield's background scenes at a slow shuffle, his enormous glasses barely staying on his face, his general demeanor suggesting a man who has been surprised by the difficulty of being alive for a very long time. He appears in crowd scenes. He serves as a background presence in public spaces, and he exists primarily to suffer. Hans Moleman gets hit by cars. He gets crushed under falling objects. He gets buried alive. He gets eaten by animals. He gets struck by lightning. He gets incinerated. He walks into traffic and disappears under wheels. He falls into open manholes. He is set on fire. He drowns. By conservative count, Hans Moleman has been killed. In canonical mainline episodes, not dream sequences, not Treehouse of Horror specials, not alternate timelines, in regular story episodes, dozens of times. Some estimates put the number at well over 100 across the show's full run. And then he shows up in the next episode completely fine. No explanation, no resurrection scene. No acknowledgement that he was dead 2 episodes ago and is now buying a hot dog from a street cart without apparent concern. He just continues to exist, available to be killed again in an endless cycle of death and return that the show treats as a running gag requiring no explanation. Most fans accept this as comedy. Moleman dies a lot. It's a bit. Don't think about it, move on. But Moleman once stated his age as 31 years old. He said this directly, in a scene, with no indication that he was joking or that the show was acknowledging the absurdity. He is 31. Look at him. He appears to be decades older than that. Something aged him catastrophically. Something took a man in what should have been his early prime and transformed him into an elderly, fragile, nearly sightless figure who shuffles through Springfield streets, being killed at regular intervals. And the same something that aged him prematurely has also, apparently, made death a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. Under the radiation theory, Moleman is the most extreme mutation in Springfield's population. While the contamination has produced various physical distortions across the town's residents, and while Homer has developed a remarkable physical resilience as a potential adaptation, Moleman represents a different possible endpoint. A man whose biology has been so comprehensively altered by nuclear exposure that his body can reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. Not heal from near-fatal trauma, the way Homer heals. Actually reconstitute after death. His cells contain some radiation-induced property that allows them to reorganize after complete system failure, to restart after the biological shutdown that should constitute a permanent ending. The same contamination that gave Blinky a third eye gave Moleman something considerably stranger, a relationship with death that resembles a revolving door rather than a locked gate. The premature aging makes sense through this framework too. Certain forms of radiation exposure accelerate cellular senescence. The same process that is killing Moleman slowly, that is aging him at multiple times the normal rate, is paradoxically also preventing him from dying permanently. The radiation that ages him is the same radiation that resets him. He is simultaneously dying faster than a normal human being and unable to die completely, trapped in a biological state that is somewhere between life and the conditions normally required to end it. Under the coma theory, Moleman's role is different and somewhat darker. He is a background character, a piece of population fill that Homer's unconscious mind doesn't care enough about to maintain with consistency. Molman dies because Homer's dreaming brain occasionally lapses, allowing minor characters to be deleted from the simulation temporarily. He comes back because the simulation needs him to fill a crowd scene, or provide a reaction shot, or serve as the recipient of some incidental violence that the show requires for a beat to land. He's not a person in this reading, he's furniture. A prop that the dream occasionally breaks and then reassembles because the dream requires a certain density of background figures to make Springfield feel populated rather than empty. This is a bleak way to read Molman, but it has the advantage of explaining the casual, consequence-free quality of his deaths. The dream doesn't process his mortality the way it processes Homer's or Marge's or the kids', because the dream only invests genuine emotional weight in the characters Homer loved. Molman is wallpaper, and you don't grieve when wallpaper is temporarily removed. Under the collective denial framework from the principal and the pauper, Molman's deaths are simply another thing Springfield has agreed not to notice. A man dies in public repeatedly, visibly, in front of witnesses, sometimes in the middle of a crowded street, and nobody investigates. Nobody calls for an inquiry. Nobody establishes a task force to understand why the same person keeps dying and then returning. The town has normalized Molman's death cycle the way it has normalized everything else that should be alarming. The three-eyed fish, the glowing billionaire, the baby who shot a man, the principal who isn't who he says he is. All of these things exist in Springfield's environment, and none of them produces sustained concern or investigation. Molman's deaths are simply one more item on a list that Springfield has collectively decided not to add up. There's a reading of Hans Molman that goes beyond the funny and into something quieter. He is the most relatable character on the show. He's not powerful. He doesn't have a special gift, or a destiny, or a secret intelligence. He's a small, old, nearly blind man who moves through a world that doesn't see him and kills him regularly without malice or intention. He's not tragic in the operatic way. He's tragic in the ordinary way, the way most suffering is tragic. Incidental, unwitnessed, not significant enough to warrant narrative attention. And every time he comes back, every time he shuffles back into a background crowd scene, unbothered, glasses askew, already halfway to the next disaster, he is representing something specific about Springfield. The people who live their lives in the margins, the people the story doesn't center, the people who experience the consequences of this town's dysfunction without ever being the protagonist of any episode about those consequences. Hans Molman gets hit by a car because Springfield's streets are poorly managed and nobody fixes them. He gets crushed by falling objects because Springfield's buildings are improperly maintained and nobody inspects them. He gets buried alive because the cemetery operations in Springfield are apparently unsupervised and nobody investigates. He is the accumulation of everything the show has established about this town's relationship to its most vulnerable residents, and he keeps surviving it, because the alternative is allowing the story to acknowledge that Springfield kills people and doesn't answer for it. Number. Section 11. The Dark Gospel of Ned Flanders. While we're on the subject of characters the show has quietly destroyed, we need to talk about Ned Flanders, because Ned is the character the show has been most comprehensively dishonest with, and the darkness the show has built into him, the darkness that sits just below the surface of his relentless cheerfulness and his unwavering faith and his generous, patient, seemingly bottomless goodwill toward his neighbors, is one of the most genuinely unsettling things in the entire series. On the surface, Ned is everything Homer is not. He's kind, in a way that doesn't seem performative. He's generous. He's physically healthy. He's financially responsible. He's a good father to Rod and Todd. He's a devoted neighbor. He is, by any objective standard the show applies, a significantly better person than Homer in almost every way that can be measured. He tries harder, he cares more, he does the work, he shows up, he forgives when forgiveness is extraordinarily difficult. He is consistent and reliable and good in ways that Homer isn't and has never claimed to be. And the show punishes him for it, systematically and without apology, across 36 years. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife, was killed in a freak accident at the Springfield Speedway. A promotional t-shirt cannon misfired. The shirts hit Maud instead of the crowd she was watching from above. She fell. She died. And the reason the cannon misfired, the specific causal chain that led to her death, traces back to Homer. Homer was dodging the t-shirts because he wanted to collect them for himself. His self-interested reflexes redirected the shirts toward Maud. His selfishness killed Ned's wife. And Ned, because Ned is who he is, forgave him. He forgave Homer for the death of Maude. He worked through his grief, eventually remarried, and continued being the kind of neighbor that Homer has never deserved to have. The show has given Ned every reason to break, and he breaks only once, in the episode where a hurricane destroys his house and the community rebuilds it so incompetently that it collapses immediately. The accumulated weight of everything Ned has endured, every kindness returned with negligence, every act of generosity met with ingratitude, every loss absorbed and forgiven and released, finally overcomes the structure holding him together. He snaps. He screams at the town. He says things he has been suppressing for as long as he can remember. And then he's institutionalized. The psychiatric evaluation that follows reveals something the show had been building toward without fully committing to. Ned's relentless niceness is not his natural personality. It is the result of childhood behavioral modification. Ned as a child was violent and uncontrollable, a genuinely feral kid with no internal regulator, no ability to manage his own aggression, no response to the normal socialization pressures of childhood. His parents, who were beatniks who didn't believe in discipline, were unable to manage him. They took him to a psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist spent years conditioning the aggression out of Ned through intensive behavioral therapy. Ned's kindness is the product of that conditioning. His patience is programmed. His forgiveness is an automatic response to a neural architecture that was rebuilt against the grain of his natural temperament, to produce good behavior regardless of the circumstances that might justify something else. This recontextualizes everything we know about Ned. His patience with Homer isn't saintly, it's pathological. He cannot express anger because his brain was wired to suppress it at a cost he can never fully see or measure. His faith isn't the settled conviction of a man who has examined the evidence and arrived at belief. It's a coping framework, a structure he needs to make meaning of a life that has given him extensive reasons for bitterness and none of the tools to express it. The show has shown us what happens when the conditioning fails, when Ned's natural temperament briefly breaks through the behavioral architecture that has contained it for decades. What emerges is not just a man who is angry, it's a man who has been carrying a bottomless reservoir of suppressed rage and grief and loss, and who doesn't know how to exist with those feelings because he was never taught how. Because the therapy took away the feelings rather than giving him ways to work with them. Ned wasn't healed as a child, he was managed. And the most deliberately cruel thing the show has embedded in Ned's story is the detail about God. In the show's own continuity, God exists. God has spoken to Homer on at least 2 separate occasions. Homer, who sleeps in church, who treats faith as a convenience to be adopted or abandoned based on what's useful to him in a given moment, who is by every observable measure the furthest thing from a devoted believer that Springfield contains. God spoke to Homer. God gave Homer advice and engaged with his questions and offered something that functioned as divine attention. God has never spoken to Ned. Ned, who attends church every Sunday with genuine devotion. Ned, who teaches his children scripture. Ned, who structures his entire ethical life around his faith, who uses his religious commitment as the organizing principle of how he treats other people, how he spends his money, how he responds to loss and grief, and the sustained unfairness of his life in Springfield. Ned is the most genuinely religious character in the show, and God, within the show's own universe where God is real and occasionally communicates with selected individuals, has apparently never felt moved to speak to him. The drunk who falls asleep in church and resents being there receives divine conversation. The devout man who has dedicated his life to sincere faith receives silence. This is not presented as a theological puzzle the show wants you to think through. It's a thesis statement about what Springfield rewards and what it ignores. The system doesn't care about moral behavior, it cares about compliance. And Ned, who was conditioned into compliance before he was old enough to make any other choice, receives the same reward that compliance has always offered in Springfield. Nothing, or worse than nothing. The appearance of reward while the actual cost accumulates in the background. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that doesn't reward rightness. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that doesn't punish wrongness. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, between the man who tries and the man who doesn't, between the man who is punished for his virtue and the man who coasts on his failures, has never closed. It was never going to close. The system isn't designed to close it. The system is designed to keep each of them exactly where they are. Homer at the plant, Ned at the church, both of them locked into their roles, both of them unable to escape the structures that contain them, for completely different reasons. Homer is too damaged to see the system clearly. Ned is too conditioned to respond to it honestly. And the show, across 3.5 decades, has never offered either of them a way out. That's not comedy, that's something bleaker than comedy. That's a show using the language of comedy to describe the specific texture of a life that does everything it's supposed to do and still ends up in the same place. The couch, the neighbor, the church across the street where the prayers go unanswered by a God who's too busy talking to Homer to notice the more sincere devotion happening next door. Number Section 12. The Floating Timeline and Why Nobody in Springfield is Allowed to Age. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted in December 1989. He is 10 years old right now, in whatever year you are reading this. Lisa was 8, Maggie was 1, Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. All of them are still exactly those ages. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When it aired in 1995, they were living in 1995. The year advances, the cultural references change, the technology in the background updates, but the characters remain at fixed ages, locked into a permanent present tense, aging never arriving because the timeline floats forward without them. Most viewers accept this without much examination. It's how animated shows work. It's a production convention, a practical decision made by creators who didn't want to commit to a fixed endpoint for their story. It's just the way things are in Springfield. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions large enough to damage the foundation of the show's internal logic. The most visible of these is the backstory problem. When the show began, Homer and Marge's history was grounded in the 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during a specific cultural moment. Their youth was shaped by the music, the fashion, the anxieties, and the particular texture of life in that era. As a narrative anchor, it was specific and it worked. Parents in their mid-30s in 1989 would have had adolescences that fit that timeline perfectly. But as the floating timeline dragged the present forward, and Homer and Marge stayed in their mid-30s, the backstory had to move with them. If they're mid-30s in 2025, they didn't meet in the late 1970s. They met around 2005. Their formative years were defined not by Watergate and disco but by MySpace and early YouTube. The show has updated accordingly. In later flashback episodes, Homer and Marge's youth is depicted in the 1990s, then in the early 2000s, then in the 2010s. Their origin story has been told and retold across the show's run, each retelling placing their formative years in a different decade, each version incompatible with the others. They were hippies once. Then they were grunge fans. Then they were in a world with cell phones and social media. The love story stays consistent. The era around it keeps sliding. Their memories are unstable. Their shared history is a document that gets rewritten whenever the floating present demands a different past. Now apply all of the theories we've been developing across this whole conversation. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen memory of an unconscious man who last saw them at their current ages and cannot imagine them older because he wasn't there to see the aging happen. The coma doesn't advance in time. It loops. And in the loop, nothing moves forward unless Homer's dreaming brain can imagine it forward, which it can't, because imagination requires information, and the information Homer has is from 1993, so everything stays where it was. His children at the ages he last held them, his wife at the age she was when he last saw her face, his house the way he left it, his world preserved in the amber of his last conscious moment. The radiation theory says nobody ages because the contamination has altered the cellular aging process at a fundamental level. The mutation has disrupted normal senescence across Springfield's entire population, not by making them immune to aging exactly, but by producing biological stability at specific age points, stability maintained by whatever the contamination has done to their cells. The same process that gave them 4 fingers and yellow skin and a particular kind of biological resilience has also, as a secondary effect, frozen the clock on their physical development. The principal and the pauper theory says nobody ages because Springfield has voted not to acknowledge the passage of time. The same collective mechanism that voted to keep the fake Skinner, that votes to forget every catastrophe, that votes to ignore every inconvenient truth, has also voted, implicitly, consistently, and without ever stating it aloud, to maintain the fiction that nobody is getting older. Because older means things are changing. Changing means nothing is permanent. Nothing being permanent means the world they've built, the relationships, the routines, the comfortable lies, all of it is provisional. And Springfield cannot afford to know that its world is provisional. The Burns immortality theory says that aging is already negotiable in this universe. If one person in Springfield has found a way to sustain biological function well past any normal human lifespan, then the concept of aging as an inevitable, universal, unstoppable process has already been shown to be conditional. The rules can be bent with sufficient resources. Burns bent them for himself. The contamination may have bent them, accidentally, for the rest of the population. The town that hosts the most radical anti-aging experiment in American history may have found itself, through no design of its own, in the radius of effects it didn't plan for. The show has demonstrated, repeatedly, that it can imagine its characters aging. Multiple flash-forward episodes have explored this territory. Lisa's wedding in Season 6 is the most sustained example. Lisa, at 23, engaged to a young British man, living in a future where the show's universe has advanced in ways that are consistent with the world it's always described. She's become the person the early seasons always suggested she'd become. Intelligent, principled, searching for connection, somewhat lonely in the particular way of people who are more capable than the environments they inhabit. The episode is emotionally coherent and lovingly made. It proves that the show knows how to write these characters as adults. It knows what they'd become. It's made the choice, consistently, deliberately, not to go there. The flash-forward episodes are windows that open and then close, glimpses of a future that the show acknowledges and then seals back off. Lisa returns to being 8, Bart returns to being 10. The future is shown to exist and then locked away. The permanent present reasserts itself. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And this is where the floating timeline becomes something larger than a production choice. The Simpsons is not just the story of one family. It has become, over 36 years, a representation of the American family at a particular cultural moment that has been extended far past its natural duration. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie have become fixtures of American culture in a way that no fictional family since has managed to replicate. They are references shared across multiple generations. They are shorthand for a particular kind of American domesticity, chaotic and loving and economically stressed and somehow enduring. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, is not permitted to change. Homer must always be middle-aged. Marge must always be patient and present. Bart must always be the kid who pushes back against everything. Lisa must always be the one who sees clearly and is not heard. Maggie must always be waiting in her silence. These roles must be held because they represent something the culture needs to hold. The messy, resilient, infuriating, devoted, dysfunctional, genuinely loving American family, the kind that survives everything and resets after every disaster and comes back to the same couch and the same television and the same Sunday night slot and the same opening credits, Bart writing his punishment lines on the chalkboard, Homer nearly running over Maggie in the driveway, the family piling onto the couch as one. The floating timeline exists because time passing means things ending, and the American family, at least the idealized version of it that The Simpsons represents, is not allowed to end, not in the imagination. Not in the place where television and memory and longing intersect. If Bart turned 11, something would break. If Lisa turned 9, the fiction would start to unravel. If Maggie said her second word, the spell that's been running since 1989 would begin to dissolve. The aging isn't prevented by radiation or coma or collective denial, though all of those are true within the show's own universe. Aging is prevented by us, by the audience, by the act of watching, every week, every syndication rerun, every streaming platform binge, confirming that the characters are still there, still the same, still the family we remember. We pressed pause in 1989. We have been pressing it every time we tune in since then. And Springfield, the impossible town on no map, the contaminated zone with the floating geography and the glowing billionaire and the silent baby genius and the unconscious man dreaming in a hospital bed, stays exactly where it was. Because we need it to. Because letting it age means admitting that 36 years have passed in the real world. that we're older now, that the children who watched the first episode are middle-aged themselves, that the couch we sat on when the show premiered is gone, or in someone else's house, or in a landfill, that the world the show was commenting on has kept moving while the show's world stayed still. The floating timeline is not Springfield's prison, it's ours. We built it, we maintain it, we choose it. Every time we watch, every time we laugh, every time we reference a Season 4 episode in the present tense as though it happened last week. We tighten the loop. We make it harder for Springfield to escape. Because if Springfield escapes, if the timeline lands somewhere and stays there, if the story advances to its natural conclusion, then the show ends. And the show ending means acknowledging that the version of America The Simpsons represents, the version with the nuclear plant and the corrupt billionaire and the incompetent government and the working-class family holding everything together through sheer determined love, was always a specific moment, not a permanent condition, that it existed in time the way everything exists in time, fully present and then past, that it was always one birthday away from dissolving into something we don't recognize anymore. So we keep watching, and nothing in Springfield changes, and the loop runs. And somewhere in a hospital bed in an impossible town, a man is dreaming, and his family is young and together and unchanged, and the credits roll, and everything resets, and we'll be back here again next week. Section 13. The Grand Unified Theory of Springfield. We've spent a long time in Springfield now. We've examined the radiation theory and built the case that the power plant has been poisoning the entire town for decades, that the physical distortions we attribute to art style are better explained as mutations, and that Burns has always known and has always considered this a feature rather than a problem. We've followed Homer's coma and made the argument that everything since April 1993 might be the dream of a man who never woke up, a man whose unconscious mind is keeping his family alive and preserved and unchanged, because that's the only way his dreaming brain knows how to love them. We've traced the story of Mona Simpson and discovered that Burns destroyed 3 generations of a family because a woman helped him up off the floor of the weapons lab she was in the process of destroying. We've reopened the shooting of Mr. Burns and found that the official answer has more holes in it than the show has ever acknowledged. We've examined Burns's impossible longevity and found that it's maintained through a system of radiation treatments and logistical infrastructure that functions as nuclear maintenance applied to a human body. We've sat with Maggie's silence and recognized it as the most sophisticated strategic choice any character in the show's history has ever made. We've watched Springfield vote to criminalize truth and exile the honest man and the principal and the pauper, and recognized in that vote the same mechanism that makes every reset, every forgotten catastrophe, every impossible continuity work. We've looked for Springfield on a map and found it everywhere and nowhere. We've counted the predictions and understood that the show doesn't predict the future so much as it prepares the culture to recognize it when it arrives. We've watched Hans Moleman die and return and die again, and understood that his cycle is the most honest statement the show has ever made about what Springfield does to its most marginal residents. We've looked under Ned Flanders's relentless goodness and found a man whose natural personality was overwritten before he was old enough to choose it. And we've stared at the floating timeline until we understood that the characters aren't frozen in time because of radiation or coma or collective denial or cartoon convention. They're frozen because we need them to be. Now, here's what all of those theories have in common. Underneath their different premises and their different evidence and their different explanatory frameworks, every one of them says the same thing. Something is structurally wrong in Springfield. Something that doesn't reduce to any single cause, that can't be resolved by fixing any single problem, that is embedded in the town's architecture so deeply that removing it would require dismantling everything else along with it. Something that has been there since the beginning, visible in every episode if you know what you're looking at, and invisible to the people inside it because the thing that makes them unable to see it is the same thing that caused it. The radiation theory says the plant did it. The coma theory says Homer's dying mind is sustaining it. The Mona Simpson theory says Burns built it as a deliberate system of control. The Who Shot Burns theory says the accountability that should have followed from the shooting was suppressed because too many people with too much to lose were invested in keeping the system running. The Burns immortality theory says the man at the center of the system has engineered his own survival so thoroughly that the system will outlast any normal mechanism that might have ended it. The Maggie theory says that the only person who might eventually disrupt it is the one person nobody is watching. The principal and the pauper says the town itself, not just Burns, not just any external force, but the collective will of Springfield's population, has been actively choosing to maintain this reality because the alternative is more frightening than the contamination. The Springfield location theory says the town protects itself through ambiguity, through legal and geographic uncertainty that prevents any external authority from establishing jurisdiction over what happens inside. The prediction theory says the show has been diagnosing all of this for 36 years, and the audience has been interpreting the diagnosis as entertainment rather than warning. The Molman and Ned theories say that this system consumes its most marginal and its most virtuous residents with equal indifference, that there is no category of person in Springfield who is safe from what the town does to people who are unlucky enough to be the ones it chooses to use up. And the floating timeline says that we, the audience, are not outside observers of this system. We are participants in its maintenance. We chose to keep the loop running. We chose to keep pressing pause. We are the mechanism that prevents Springfield from advancing to the natural conclusion of its own story, because that conclusion would require us to admit something we haven't been willing to admit, that this was always about time, that the show has always been a story about time passing and things ending and the desperate human wish to hold on to what we love past the point where holding is possible, that Homer Simpson, whether he's dreaming in a coma, or working at a dangerous plant, or stumbling through yet another episode, is always trying to do one thing: stay with his family, keep the house, keep the kids young, keep Marge there, in that kitchen, in that house, at the end of that street. Keep everything exactly as it is for as long as possible, because as long as it's exactly as it is, it hasn't ended yet. That's not a cartoon. That's not 36 seasons of a television show. That's what love looks like when it's also grief. When you love something so much that you can't let it become what it naturally becomes, which is a memory. When you keep the loop running, not because you don't know it's a loop, but because outside the loop is the knowledge of everything the loop was protecting you from knowing. The theories don't ruin The Simpsons. They reveal what the show has always been at its deepest level. Underneath all the gags and the guest appearances and the Treehouse of Horror specials and the couch gags and the 36 years of cultural commentary. A story about a family that loves each other in a world that is continuously trying to prevent them from being okay, and who keep finding each other at the end of every episode anyway, who keep ending up on the couch, who keep laughing at something that wasn't supposed to be funny, who keep surviving. Burns didn't win. Burns has the power and the money and the immortality and the empire, but Homer goes home every night. He goes home to the house on Evergreen Terrace. He goes home to Marge and the kids, and the argument and the dinner, and the television, and the dog on the couch. He goes home to his family. That's the thing that Burns, with all his resources and all his strategy and all his engineered survival, has never managed. To go home, to have a home that means something, to be held by people who chose to hold him. Homer has that. Homer, who is too damaged by radiation and childhood loss and physical brain injury to understand most of what has been done to him, who is too cognitively impaired to see the architecture of his own suffering, who has been exploited and contaminated and manipulated by the same system his entire life, goes home every night to the most important thing in Springfield, his family, and in the dream, if it's a dream, that's all he's ever asked for, all he's ever generated, episode after episode, for 36 years, the same family, the same house, the same improbable, imperfect, irreplaceable life, preserved in the amber of his love for it. Running in the loop, his unconscious mind refuses to stop generating. Homer's coma isn't a nightmare, it's a love letter, written in television, in episodes, in the endless small disasters and improbable survivals and couch gags and cold opens of a show that has been running for longer than most of its audience has been alive. A love letter to his family. To Marge, to Bart, to Lisa, to Maggie, who is waiting in her silence, to tell him something he hasn't heard yet. Springfield will never be healed. The plant will keep leaking. Burns will keep surviving. The town will keep forgetting. Nobody will age. Nobody will leave. Nobody will arrive from outside to fix what's been broken for decades. The loop will run. And Homer will keep dreaming, or waking, or some state between the two that we don't have a word for yet. He'll keep going to work and coming home, and strangling Bart in the kitchen, and dancing with Marge in the living room, and sitting on the couch with his family while the credits roll. Because in Springfield, the story never ends. The family never splits apart. The house on Evergreen Terrace is always lit from inside. And somewhere behind the eyes of a man who chose to put the crayon back in his brain because the truth was too much to live with, there is the version of Homer Simpson who understood everything clearly, just once, for a brief and devastating window of time. He understood what his life was. He understood what had been taken from him. He understood who had taken it and what the cost had been across 3 generations. He understood that the comfortable fog was not freedom, but it was the only home he had ever truly chosen for himself. And he chose it again. He put the crayon back in, and he went home, and he sat on the couch, and the music played, and Springfield was Springfield again. And that's the most honest thing the show has ever said about any of us. That sometimes we know and we choose not to know. That sometimes the loop is the only safe place. That sometimes the dream is the realest thing you have. That's Springfield. That's the show. That's 36 seasons and 800 episodes and the longest-running animated series in American history, reduced to what it's always actually been underneath everything else. A man who loves his family so much he can't let them go. Even after the vending machine fell. Even in the dream. Even now. That's the whole point. Number. Section 14. The Sislac Hypothesis. Moe's Tavern as the town's true nerve center. There is a location in Springfield that the show has been using as a confessional booth for 36 years. A place where the town's residents go when they have something to say that they can't say anywhere else. A place that has, across hundreds of episodes, accumulated more genuine emotional honesty than any other location in the show's universe. And the man who runs it, who listens to everything, who pours the drinks and keeps the secrets and occasionally picks up the phone to threaten people who call with prank numbers, may be the most important secondary character in Springfield's history. Moe Sislak runs Moe's Tavern. He has been running it for 36 years. He will, presumably, be running it when the show finally ends, whenever that is. He is gruff and frequently unkind and deeply pessimistic about his own prospects in life, and he is, by the evidence of multiple episodes, one of the few genuinely lonely people in a show that has lonely characters the way most shows have background extras. His loneliness is not incidental. It is the defining condition of his existence in Springfield, and the show has built it into him with a specificity and a consistency that separates it from the generic bachelor comedian archetype he superficially resembles. Moe knows things. This is the thing that gets overlooked in most analyses of his character. He is the bartender at the social hub of Springfield's adult male population. Homer, Lenny, Carl, Barney, the full cast of Springfield's working-class male residents, they all come to Moe's when something is wrong, or when they want to talk, or when they need to be somewhere that isn't the place where whatever is wrong is happening, and they talk. People talk to bartenders in ways they don't talk to spouses, to bosses, to neighbors, to anyone who has stakes in the outcome of what's being said. The bartender's position is structurally confidential in a way that doesn't require any formal arrangement. You talk to Moe because Moe is there and he's not going to do anything with it except pour you another drink. This means Moe has heard, across 36 years of being the central bar in Springfield, essentially everything. He has heard Homer's confessions. He has been present for the moments when Homer's defenses come down and something genuine comes out, the fear and the love and the occasional startling clarity that breaks through the cognitive damage long enough to say something true. He has heard about the plant and about Burns and about the things that go wrong at work that Homer comes home and doesn't tell Marge. He has heard Barney's complete emotional history, including the parts of it that Barney himself doesn't have reliable access to anymore given the drinking. He has heard the town's male population, its working-class core, process the things that Springfield does to them across 3.5 decades. And Moe keeps it all. He doesn't use it. He doesn't leverage it. He doesn't trade in information the way someone with his access to confidential disclosure could potentially trade in it. He just knows. He holds the town's secrets in the same gruff, unremarkable way that he holds the bar itself, as a function rather than as a choice, as the thing he does because it's what he does, because the bar is what he has and the listening is what comes with it. The tavern itself was, within the show's continuity, bankrupted during the Burns sun-blocking crisis. Burns's scheme, which was designed to force every household to purchase electricity from the plant, also had the incidental effect of shutting down businesses that depended on foot traffic and ambient social commerce. And Moe's was among them. The bar was destroyed by Burns's scheme the same way the retirement home was destroyed, the same way the school's budget was destroyed, the same way groundskeeper Willie's employment was destroyed. Burns's campaign of economic expansion had broad collateral damage, and Moe was in the path of it. And yet the bar survived. It continues to operate. In the show's floating timeline, Moe's Tavern is as permanent a fixture of Springfield as the plant itself, enduring through every disaster, every reset, every catastrophe that should logically have ended its operation. The bar is always there. Moe is always behind it. Homer is always on the stool. There's a reading of Moe's Tavern that the show doesn't offer explicitly, but that the evidence supports. The bar is the one location in Springfield where the collective denial has the thinnest coverage. People don't come to Moe's to maintain the fiction. They come to Moe's because they're tired of maintaining the fiction. The bar is where Springfield goes when Springfield is too much to keep performing. And Moe, who has been listening to this for 36 years, is the keeper of everything Springfield can't officially acknowledge. He knows more than anyone in this town, except possibly Maggie. And he's the one person who would never do anything with what he knows, because doing something with it would require believing that something could be done. And Moe, beneath the hostility and the failed romantic ambitions and the regular threats against prank callers, does not believe that something can be done. He has been here too long. He has heard too much. He knows exactly what Springfield is, and he keeps pouring the drinks, because keeping the drinks poured is the only response that doesn't require a hope he can't sustain. Moe Sislak is not a secondary character. He is Springfield's conscience, contained in a man too worn down to exercise it. He knows what the plant is doing. He knows what Burns has done to the people who come through his door. He knows what Homer's life costs Homer and why Homer keeps coming back to the same bar stool. He knows all of it. And every night he dims the lights and wipes down the bar and goes to whatever room he goes to, alone, knowing everything that will still be just as true tomorrow. That's not a supporting character. That's a tragedy wearing a comedy costume. Exactly like the show it appears in. Number. Section 15. The Krusty the Clown parallel a life built on performance. There is a character in Springfield who has been performing his own identity for so long that the performance and the identity have become indistinguishable, even to him. Krusty the Clown is a television personality, a franchise, a brand, and somewhere underneath all of that, a man named Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yeruchim Krustovsky, the son of a rabbi who wanted his son to carry on the faith and instead produced someone who made children laugh for a living and carried the guilt of that choice for decades. The Krusty as mirror for the show reading is one that the show has earned through careful accumulation of detail. Krusty has been on television for as long as Springfield has existed in the show's timeline. He is, in the town's cultural economy, as central as the plant in the sense that he provides something the population consumes without examining. The plant provides electricity. Krusty provides entertainment. Both are owned by powerful interests. Both have a complicated relationship with the health of the people who depend on them. Krusty is a bad person in several documented ways. His food products have caused illness, his merchandise is shoddily made, and occasionally dangerous. He has been convicted of crimes. He has treated his employees, including Sideshow Bob and Sideshow Mel, with a casual cruelty that has, in at least one case, produced an attempted murderer in response. He smokes on television and has done so in front of children for decades. He is, by any objective assessment of his professional conduct, someone who should have faced consequences that he has consistently not faced. And yet Springfield loves Krusty. Children watch his show. Adults have affectionate memories of it. Bart's devotion to Krusty is one of the show's most consistent character notes. The town forgives Krusty everything, absorbs every revelation about his actual character without adjusting its relationship to him, continues to consume his product and support his brand, and treat his image as a comfort rather than a warning. This is exactly what Springfield does with Burns and the plant. The principle is identical. The product may cause harm. The person providing it is not trustworthy. The evidence of this is available and occasionally public. And Springfield continues because the alternative, examining what it's been consuming and deciding on the basis of that examination to stop, is too destabilizing. You can't examine your electricity provider the way you can examine a television personality. But you can choose not to examine the television personality either, and Springfield consistently chooses not to examine either one. Krusty's relationship with his father adds the emotional layer that the character needs to be more than a simple joke about show business compromise. Rabbi Krustovsky rejected Herschel's career choice. He cut off his son for becoming a clown, for pursuing entertainment rather than faith, for choosing the audience over the congregation. And Krusty, unable to reconcile his father's rejection with his own need for that rejection to not be accurate, built an entire professional identity around the thing his father rejected him for. He became Krusty the Clown so completely that Herschel Kristofsky barely exists anymore. The performance consumed the performer. There is something in this that rhymes with what the coma theory says about Homer. Homer is also performing. Homer is performing being alive, performing being present, performing being a father and a husband and an employee in the ordinary way that people perform these things. When the coma theory says he's been unconscious since 1993, the performance is the show. The show is Homer's performance of a life he can no longer actually access. Krusty's performance of Krusty the Clown is the show within the show, a man performing an identity so completely that the man underneath has become inaccessible even to himself. Springfield is a town of performances. Ned performs goodness. Skinner performs being Skinner. Krusty performs joy. Burns performs power, which is perhaps the most honest performance in town since the power is real. Homer performs adequacy. And underneath all the performances, in the spaces where the costume doesn't quite cover, Springfield is whatever it's been since before the characters we know arrived in it. Something older than the show. Something that was already broken when the breaking started. Number. Section 16. The Lisa Simpson Problem Intelligence as Isolation. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She has an IQ that her teachers describe with adjectives usually reserved for once-in-a-generation outliers. She plays the saxophone with a proficiency and an emotional depth that surpasses most adults who have studied the instrument for years. She has, across 36 seasons, been consistently right about almost every significant factual and ethical question the show has put to her. She has changed essentially nothing. This is the Lisa problem. Not the in-universe problem, the problem the show is describing, but the meta-problem, the fact that the show has chosen to depict, with extraordinary consistency and unusual care, a character who is brilliant and good and correct and makes no lasting difference to the world she inhabits, who fights and is right and fights again and is still right and comes back and fights again and remains, at the end of every episode, exactly where she was, at the beginning of it, 8 years old, still trying, still not being heard. The show presents this as a feature of Lisa's situation rather than a flaw in the storytelling, and it's worth taking that presentation seriously. The Lisa problem is not lazy writing. It's the show's most sustained and most uncomfortable argument. Intelligence does not by itself produce change. Being right does not by itself produce change. Having the argument clearly articulated and the evidence properly assembled and the case compellingly made does not, by itself, produce change. What produces change is power, and Lisa has no power in Springfield. She's 8 years old and her family loves her and the community is either indifferent or actively resistant to what she's saying, and none of the cognitive capability in the world is sufficient to overcome the gap between what she can see and what the structures around her will permit. This is the hardest thing the show has ever said, harder than anything in the radiation theory or the coma theory or the Burns immortality theory, because those theories are about external forces acting on the characters. The Lisa problem is about the limits of internal capability in a world that has already decided what it's going to do. Lisa keeps fighting because stopping would mean accepting that the gap cannot be closed, and Lisa is not yet old enough or cynical enough to accept that. She is 8 years old and she still believes that if you make the argument clearly enough, if you assemble the evidence carefully enough, if you find the right words and say them in the right order at the right volume, something will change. 36 years of the same outcome have not broken her of this belief. Every episode she comes back and tries again. This is either the most hopeful or the most devastating thing in the show, depending on how you hold it. If you're watching from inside Springfield, trapped in the same loop as everyone else, unable to see the structure from inside the structure, Lisa's persistence looks like the most heroic thing in the show. She is the canary in the coal mine who will not stop singing even when the gas levels rise. She is the person who insists on truth in a town that has made truth illegal. She is what goodness looks like when it hasn't yet been broken or conditioned or contaminated into something more comfortable. If you're watching from outside Springfield, from the position the coma theory or the radiation theory gives you, Lisa's persistence looks different. It looks like the most heartbreaking thing in the show. Because she is 8 years old and she has been 8 years old for 36 years and she will never be 9. She will never be old enough to leave Springfield and take her intelligence somewhere it might actually function. She will never have the power that adulthood might give her to translate her capability into actual change. She is frozen. Permanently, unbreakably frozen, at the age of maximum helplessness and maximum clarity, understanding everything and able to change nothing, forever. The floating timeline is not neutral for Lisa. It's not neutral for any of them. But Lisa is its most specific victim. For Homer, the frozen timeline means never losing his family. For Bart, it means never having to face adult consequences for his choices. For Maggie, it means unlimited time to plan. But for Lisa, the frozen timeline means being right forever and never being old enough to do anything about it. She is trapped in the moment of childhood that has the clearest sight and the least power, and it will never change, because the show's deepest structural choice is to keep it this way. Lisa Simpson is the show's conscience. She's also its prisoner. Both things are true simultaneously, and the show has been honest about both for 36 years. That's more honesty about the nature of clear-sightedness in a world that doesn't want to be seen clearly than most shows manage in their entire runs. Section 17. The question nobody asks about Grandpa. Abe Simpson is the family member most fully covered by the show's comfortable habit of dismissal. He is old. He tells rambling stories that go nowhere. He falls asleep in places where sleeping is inappropriate. He is confused about current events and current technology, and the passage of time in ways that are played consistently for comedy. He is, in the show's economy of character, the source of gentle mockery and occasional affectionate exasperation. He is the grandfather. He is not the person anyone in the show or the audience takes seriously as an agent with full access to his own moral complexity. But Abe Simpson has done things. Specific, documented, morally significant things that the show has revealed across its run, and that the comedy framing has prevented from receiving the weight they deserve. He told Homer that his mother was dead when his mother was alive. He sustained this lie for 27 years. He chose to give his son a grave and a story about maternal loss rather than the truth, which is that his wife was a fugitive and that the man responsible for her fugitive status was the billionaire who would go on to employ his son. He made a decision, when Homer was 6 years old, about what Homer was allowed to know about his own life. And that decision produced a man who spent his entire adulthood shaped by a grief that didn't have to exist. He made a deal with Burns. In exchange for his silence about a crime Burns committed, Burns guaranteed Homer's employment at the plant. Abe traded his silence about Burns's wrongdoing for his son's job security. He did this without telling Homer what the trade was. He gave Homer lifetime employment at the plant of the man who had forced his wife underground, arranged through a deal that implicated Abe in Burns's crimes, and he never told Homer any of it. These are not small things. These are the two most consequential choices anyone made in the backstory of the Simpson family, and they were both made by Abe. By the grandfather who falls asleep at inappropriate times and tells stories that seem to go nowhere. By the man everyone in the family treats with a combination of love and exasperation that never quite includes taking him seriously as the architect of the family's most fundamental damage. The show has been telling you this about Abe for decades. It's told it quietly and quickly, in episodes that surrounded the revelations with enough comedy that the weight didn't accumulate in the way it should. But the facts are there. Abe Simpson made the choices that created Homer's wound. Abe Simpson made the deal that keeps Homer at the plant. Abe Simpson is responsible, in ways that the show acknowledges and then moves past, for the specific shape of the damage that runs through the Simpson family. And Abe is old. Abe is very old and frequently confused and often more past than present in his attention, which means that the man who caused the most damage is also the man most insulated from its consequences by the comedy of his age. Nobody confronts Abe the way someone should confront Abe. Homer can't, because Homer doesn't have all the information. Marge can't, because she doesn't have it either. The show can't, not really, because confronting Abe would require treating his actions with a seriousness that the show's comedy structure makes structurally difficult to sustain. So Abe keeps telling his rambling stories, and the stories occasionally contain fragments of the truth, scattered through the confusion and the non-sequiturs, available to anyone paying close enough attention. But Springfield doesn't pay close attention to its elderly. It tolerates them with the same comfortable dismissal it applies to everything else that would be inconvenient to examine directly. Abe Simpson is the show's most important, unreliable narrator. and nobody has ever asked him the right questions. Number. Section 18. The Treehouse of Horror as Documentary Evidence. Every October, The Simpsons suspends its normal continuity and produces the Treehouse of Horror special. 3 short horror parodies. Non-canonical, existing outside the show's normal timeline. Impossible events that are explicitly marked as not counting for the purposes of the show's ongoing story. Deaths that don't stick. Transformations that are reversed. Rules of reality that are bent to serve the specific horror-comedy hybrid the episodes are attempting. These are the episodes most viewers treat as the show at its most consequence-free. They're Halloween specials. They're parodies. Nothing that happens in them is supposed to matter. But here's a different way to look at them. What if the Treehouse of Horror episodes are the show's unconscious revealing what it cannot say in the normal continuity? What if the horror comedy genre that these specials operate in gives the writers license to say things directly that the regular episodes can only imply? In the normal episodes, Homer can be threatened but never actually killed. Bart can face danger but never genuine harm. The family can be in peril, but the peril always resolves in favor of the status quo. These constraints are part of the format, part of what makes the show sustainable across 36 years. You can't actually kill the main characters. You can't actually break the family. So the regular episodes have to work around these constraints, gesturing at darkness while staying technically within the bounds of a primetime animated series. The Treehouse of Horror has no such constraints. Characters die freely. The family is destroyed, killed, transformed, eaten, possessed, obliterated. The world ends multiple times. Springfield is consumed by various supernatural or extraterrestrial forces on a near-annual basis. And none of it sticks, because none of it is canonical, because everyone gets to hit reset on November 1st and pretend it didn't happen, which is, when you think about it, exactly what Springfield does with everything else. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are structured exactly like Springfield's normal relationship with catastrophe. Something terrible and total happens. The credits roll, and by the next episode, everything is fine. The mechanism of the reset is usually that the Treehouse episodes explicitly mark themselves as non-canonical, but the functional result is identical to what happens after any regular episode catastrophe. The event occurred. It is then not acknowledged. The show continues as though it didn't happen. What the Treehouse specials add is volume and visibility. They show you, in concentrated form and in explicit horror genre terms, the full range of what Springfield could be subjected to and then recovered from through the power of the reset. Alien invasions, demon possession, zombie apocalypse, the literal end of the world. The show puts Springfield through all of these, every year. And every year Springfield survives because Springfield always survives. Because the reset is always available. Because the loop always runs. Because Homer always wakes up. And it was all a dream or a holiday special, and tomorrow is a regular episode and everything is fine. The Treehouse specials are the show dreaming out loud about what it would do to its characters if it were allowed to do anything. And what it would do, apparently, is exactly what the radiation theory and the coma theory and all the other theories suggest is already happening in the regular episodes. Slow, progressive, systematic damage that the characters cannot escape and cannot address because the structure that contains them prevents both. In the Treehouse, the damage is fast and visible and spectacular. In the regular episodes, it's slow and invisible and cumulative. But it's the same damage. Springfield is being destroyed in every episode, in every format, in the horror specials and the sitcom episodes and the theatrical film. The only difference is the speed and the visibility. The Treehouse just shows you what the rest of the show is doing at a slower pace. Number. Section 19. The show that diagnosed America before America had a diagnosis. The Simpsons premiered in December 1989. The Cold War was ending. The economic optimism of the Reagan years was giving way to something more complicated and harder to name. The American middle class was beginning a long, slow contraction that wouldn't be fully visible for another decade. The gap between the promise of American life and its actual delivery for working-class families was widening, and the cultural vocabulary for describing that gap was still being assembled. The Simpsons arrived with the vocabulary already assembled. Homer Simpson is a working-class man with a steady job at an industrial facility who owns his house and feeds his family, and is, by the standards of previous generations, economically comfortable. He is also a man for whom comfort is perpetually precarious. Burns can fire him. the plant can close. The deal that Abe made with Burns is the only guarantee that his employment continues regardless of merit, and Homer doesn't know about the deal. He goes to work every day without knowing why he's kept on, without knowing that the ground under his economic security is built on a transaction he was never told about. This is not a cartoon exaggeration of the American working class experience. This is a description of it, the job that feels secure but isn't. The employer who can end your livelihood with a decision you'll have no input into. The complete dependence on a single income source that creates a vulnerability so total that expressing any dissatisfaction, any critique, any honest assessment of the situation feels too dangerous to risk. Homer endures Burns's contempt, his impossible not knowing of Homer's name, his dismissiveness, and his cruelty, because the alternative is the void. And the void, for a man who grew up the way Homer grew up, is too frightening to face. The show named this in 1989, with precision and with emotional accuracy, and then kept naming it for 36 years as the conditions it was describing got progressively more severe. By the time the show's cultural dominance was at its peak, in the mid-1990s, the economic anxiety the show had been describing was becoming impossible to ignore. By the time the Simpsons movie came out in 2007, Springfield getting sealed under a dome for being too contaminated was not far from what was actually happening in real American communities where industrial contamination had been deferred and denied for decades. By the time the Trump episode prediction became a cultural reference point in 2016, the satirical vision of a political system so thoroughly captured by wealth and spectacle that a reality television personality could become president was not satirical anymore. It was descriptive. The show didn't get darker over time. America got closer to Springfield over time. The show stayed where it was. The country moved toward it. And the most unsettling piece of this is not the Trump prediction or the environmental contamination or any of the individual points where satire became description. It's the structural parallel. Springfield is a community where one billionaire effectively controls the entire economic and political infrastructure, where the population is too economically dependent on that billionaire to challenge him effectively, where the medical and legal and governmental institutions that should provide oversight and accountability have been compromised by his wealth and his influence, where the population's access to accurate information about their own situation is limited by the same dynamics that limit their access to economic alternatives, where every system that might protect them from the person most directly harming them has been oriented, over decades, in the direction that serves his interests rather than theirs. This is not a description of Springfield. This is a description of a significant number of American communities in 2025. Springfield is not a prediction. Springfield is a diagnosis that was written in 1989 and that the patient has been getting closer to every year since. The show held up a mirror. The audience watched themselves get into the mirror. And the family on the screen stayed the same, frozen in 1989, watching us arrive at them across 3.5 decades of choices and circumstances and accumulated consequences. Homer Simpson didn't get us here, but he understood the system that would. And every Sunday night he went to work, and he came home, and he sat on the couch, and the loop ran, and tomorrow was another day. Just like us. Number. Section 20, the last theory, and the only one that matters. All of the theories we've examined share a structure. They each identify something wrong with Springfield, something that explains the anomalies and the contradictions and the impossible things. The radiation explains the biology. The coma explains the frozen time. The Burns conspiracy explains the power structure. The collective denial explains the resets. The geographic impossibility explains the accountability gap. Each theory identifies a cause, traces its effects, and assembles the evidence into a picture that makes Springfield make sense in a new way. But none of them are the last theory. None of them are the one that everything else points toward when you follow each of them to its final destination. The last theory is simpler than any of them, and it doesn't require radiation or coma or conspiracy or denial. It requires only attention paid to the thing the show has been doing for 36 years, quietly, without announcement, through comedy and through continuity, and through the sheer accumulated weight of hundreds of hours of television about one family in one impossible town. The last theory is this: Springfield is wherever you are. Homer is whoever you're afraid of becoming. Marge is whoever you've promised yourself you'd be worthy of. Bart is who you were before you got too old to be honest about being a kid. Lisa is who you still are, underneath. still believing that the right argument exists, and that you'll find it, and that when you do, things will change. Maggie is who you'll become when you finally stop performing and start doing the thing you've been building toward all this time. The show has been running for 36 years because it keeps being recognizable. Not because the jokes are timeless, though some of them are. Not because the animation is exceptional, though it's capable of real beauty. Because every week, in some configuration of these 5 people, something true is said about what it's like to be a person in a world that is more complicated and more indifferent and more resistant to goodness than it was supposed to be. Homer loves his family to a degree that his cognitive limitations and his emotional damage and the systematic breaking that his childhood and his contaminated environment have done to him cannot suppress. This love is the only thing in Springfield that Burns has never been able to contaminate, regulate, price, or expel on a train. It just keeps running, below all the damage, the way the show keeps running, below all the theories, below all the analysis, below all the evidence of what Springfield actually is. That's what the show is about. Not the plant, not the coma, not the shooting, not the immortality or the impossibility or the floating timeline or any of the dark and fascinating things we've been following through these hours together. The show is about a man who loves his family, who keeps finding his way back to them through every disaster and every reset and every episode that ends with everything on fire and then begins the next week with everything normal again. Who survives, improbably, repeatedly, not because the radiation made him durable, not because the coma made him invulnerable, but because the show needs him to survive. Because the show is a dream about a family, and the dreamer won't let the dream end. Because somewhere in a hospital bed or at a kitchen table or on a couch in front of a television, someone who loves their family is watching Homer love his family, and that shared thing is the reason we keep coming back. Springfield will never be healed. The theories don't end. The plant keeps leaking, Burns keeps surviving, the timeline keeps floating, Maggie keeps waiting, Lisa keeps trying, Bart keeps not growing up, Homer keeps going to work and coming home, and we keep watching. Because the show, underneath all of its darkness and all of its theories and all of its 36 years of impossible Springfield, is about the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing, a family. Together. Still there. Still there. That's the whole mystery. That was always the mystery. The Mona Simpson story does not end with her exile. It continues in the spaces between what the show tells you and what the show leaves you to work out on your own. Consider the full shape of what Burns did. He didn't just identify a woman to the FBI. He triggered a chain of consequences that would take 3 decades to fully play out, and that would touch every person in the Simpson family in ways that none of them ever fully understood. Homer grows up without his mother. This is the first consequence. Not just the emotional consequence, though that is enormous, but the developmental one. A child who loses a parent early, who grows up in the space where that parent should have been, develops differently. The absence shapes the architecture of the self in ways that presence would not. Homer's desperate need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his compulsive relationship with food and with comfort, his inability to sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for something that will make it stop, all of these are the behavioral signature of early attachment disruption. Psychologists have a vocabulary for this. The show doesn't use it, but the show depicts it with an accuracy that makes the vocabulary feel redundant. Homer needs Marge to love him because he couldn't keep his mother. Homer works for Burns because the deal Abe made ensures that he cannot be fired, and being fired would mean the loss of the one stable structure he has. Homer doesn't confront Burns because confronting Burns would mean risking everything he's built on top of the wound, and the wound is too large to let anything else destabilize. Burns knows this. Burns has always known this. He didn't engineer Homer's psychology deliberately. He didn't sit in his office and plan for the boy whose mother he was driving out of town to become the perfect, compliant employee 2 decades later. But the outcome serves him, and Burns is sophisticated enough to recognize useful outcomes and preserve them. The deal with Grandpa is the final piece of this architecture. By the time Abe makes the deal, Homer is already in his 20s. The damage is already done. The mother is gone. The wound is formed. The emotional structure that will define Homer's adult life is already in place. The deal doesn't create the dependency. The deal simply ensures that the dependency can be indefinitely maintained without the risk of the one external event, job loss, that might force Homer into a confrontation with his own situation. Burns gives Homer lifetime employment not out of generosity, but out of the same instinct that drives him to hire Homer in the first place. A man in Homer's psychological position, with Homer's specific history and Homer's specific damage, is the best possible employee for a nuclear facility that should be shut down. He will not look too closely. He will not ask the right questions. He will not organize or agitate or contact a regulatory body. He will come to work every day and be grateful for it. Mona spent 27 years as a fugitive not knowing this. She spent 27 years not knowing that the son she left sleeping in his bed had grown up and gone to work for the man who forced her out. She spent 27 years not knowing that the wound she left in Homer had been carefully maintained by the systems around him to ensure it never healed. When she finally came back and saw Homer, she saw a man in his 30s who loved his family and worked at the plant and could not entirely articulate why his life felt the way it felt. She saw the outcome of the choice she'd been forced to make. She saw what Burns had done with the years she lost. The show is generous to her in the reunion episode. It gives her and Homer a scene of genuine tenderness, of a mother and son, finding each other after decades in the space, created by one man's decision to destroy her life over a biological weapons lab she'd tried to shut down. The emotional authenticity of that scene is real. The show earns it. But the scene is also, if you hold it against the full shape of what we've been describing, one of the most devastating things the show has ever put on screen. Because what Mona sees when she looks at Homer is not just her son, it's the cost. The specific, embodied walking and talking cost of what Burns did, and what Abe enabled, and what the system of Springfield produced in the space where she should have been. She died before she could fix it. The show gives her that grace note, the quiet death with Homer beside her, holding her hand. It does not give her the grace note of having actually fixed anything. Because some damage doesn't fix, some absence creates a shape that presence cannot undo. Homer lost his mother at 6 years old, and the man he became in her absence is who he is now. And Mona's return, however genuine and however moving, cannot reach back 30 years and change the boy who woke up and found her gone. Burns took that. Burns took the Homer who would have existed if his mother had stayed, and he has been profiting from that theft for over 3 decades, in the most direct and concrete way possible. Every paycheck Homer collects from the plant is Burns collecting the return on an investment he made when Homer was 6 years old and didn't know it yet. The conspiracy runs deeper than any single episode reveals. It runs through the full length of the show, through every Homer episode and every Mona episode and every moment when Homer almost connects the dots and then doesn't quite, because the damage that prevents the connection is the same damage the man at the center of the conspiracy inflicted. This is what the Mona Simpson story is actually about. Not a woman who made a choice and paid for it. A family that was broken by a billionaire's grudge and the systematic way that breaking was maintained, reinforced, and profited from across 3 generations. The Three Stooges syndrome scene is one of the most quoted in the show's history, and it is almost always quoted as a joke. The doctor lists every disease known to medical science. Burns has them all. They cancel each other out. Nobody can get through the door. The audience laughs and moves on, because the scene is constructed to be funny, because Burns's delivery is dry and his reaction is the specific kind of insufferable self-satisfaction that the character deploys when confronted with evidence of his own exceptionalism. But take the scene out of the comedy context and hold it against what we know about Burns's medical situation. Every disease present simultaneously. Every pathogen and every degeneration and every cellular malfunction that a human body can experience. All of them active at once inside one body. This is not a description of health. This is a description of a biological system under siege from every direction simultaneously. The fact that the diseases cancel each other out is not an advantage in any meaningful sense. It means Burns's body is a constant battlefield, that every cellular process is contested, that nothing in his physical form is operating cleanly or normally or in the way biology intends. The only thing keeping this in equilibrium, the only thing preventing any single disease from gaining dominance and ending the standoff, is the weekly radiation treatment. This is the control rod in Burns's personal reactor. Remove it and the equilibrium collapses. Every disease surges simultaneously. The body, already compromised beyond any reasonable human threshold, fails catastrophically. What the treatments are actually doing, when you follow the logic through, is maintaining a state of managed chronic crisis. Burns is not alive in the way a healthy person is alive. He is alive in the way a system under constant catastrophic stress can be alive when that stress is precisely managed. Every week, the treatment recalibrates the system. Every week, the diseases are pushed back into equilibrium. Every week, Burns is kept on the right side of the catastrophic failure that would otherwise have claimed him decades ago. Smithers' role in this context becomes something that goes beyond devotion or loyalty or even love, though the show gives him all of those things. Smithers is the mechanism by which the treatment schedule is maintained. He manages Burns' calendar. He ensures the appointments are kept. He monitors Burns' condition with a vigilance that most people would find either touching or disturbing, depending on how they hold the relationship between them. But the clinical fact is this: if Smithers ever left, if he was removed from his position for any reason, the likelihood that Burns would successfully manage his own treatment schedule without assistance approaches zero. Burns is brilliant, but he is also 100-and-some years old and physically frail and frequently distracted by his various schemes and occasional cruelties. He needs someone to make sure he shows up for the appointment that keeps him alive. Smithers knows this. The show has established clearly that Smithers understands Burns' medical situation at a level of specificity that no one else does. He is not merely devoted, he is load-bearing. The entire edifice of Burns' survival is partly resting on Wayland Smithers' administrative competence and schedule management. Take Smithers away and the edifice begins to wobble. Give it a week and it falls. This produces a relationship of mutual dependency that the show's surface-reading, devoted assistant, and imperious employer only partially captures. Burns needs Smithers to stay alive. Smithers knows Burns needs him to stay alive. Neither of them discusses this directly because discussing it would require both of them to acknowledge a vulnerability that neither is positioned to acknowledge comfortably. So they maintain the fiction of the employer-employee relationship, the dynamic of superiority and servitude, while the actual structural reality is that these two men are locked together by Burns' biological dependency in a way that makes the power differential between them considerably more complicated than it appears. Burns has been alive for over a century through the application of industrial-scale resources to the problem of keeping one body running past any reasonable endpoint. He has not solved death. He has made death expensive enough that it keeps losing the negotiation. And the negotiation will continue, week by week, treatment by treatment, Smithers by Smithers, for as long as the infrastructure holds. In Springfield, the infrastructure always holds, because Burns built it, and Burns built it specifically to ensure it would outlast anything that might otherwise end him. The Armin Tamzarian episode is the most honest episode of The Simpsons ever produced. This is not a popular opinion. The episode is consistently ranked among the worst in the series. But the ranking reflects discomfort, not quality, because the episode does something genuinely uncomfortable in the most direct way the show has ever attempted. It shows you the mechanism. Every other time Springfield forgets something it should remember, every other time a catastrophe is absorbed and reversed, every other time the show's reset button is pressed and the town returns to its pre-crisis state, it happens off-screen. One episode ends with something irreversible having occurred. The next episode begins with everything restored. The gap between those two episodes is where the forgetting happens, and because it happens in the gap, because you don't see it, it's easy to attribute it to cartoon logic or episodic storytelling or the general conventions of animated television. It's easy to accept it as the unremarkable background noise of a show that doesn't track its own continuity. The principal and the pauper takes the gap and puts it on screen. It shows you the meeting. It shows you the vote. It shows you Judge Snyder's decree. It shows you the real Skinner being physically ejected from the community, tied to a train, removed from his own life so that the comfortable fiction can continue. It shows you exactly what has always been happening in those gaps, the collective decision to maintain the agreed-upon version of reality regardless of its relationship to the actual truth. And the audience reacted with fury, not because the episode was badly made, because it was too honest about something the show's audience had been participating in without examining their participation. Every time you watched a Springfield catastrophe resolve between episodes and accepted the resolution without questioning it, you were doing what the town of Springfield does. You were voting to maintain the fiction. You were agreeing, as a viewer, to not press on the gap, to accept that the permanent present is real, and that whatever happened last week was resolved in the gap, and that today is a fresh start with no obligation to yesterday. The episode made that vote visible and made the audience confront the fact that they'd been casting it all along. The real Seymour Skinner is the most sympathetic character in the entire run of the series, by the measure of what he endures and what it costs him. He is a war hero. He survived conditions that end most people. He came home, not to triumph and recognition, but to the discovery that his identity, his name, his relationship with his own mother, had been occupied by someone else for 2 decades. He arrived with the truth, the documentary evidence of who he actually was, and the truth was criminalized and he was physically expelled from the community. He's out there somewhere, the last honest man in Springfield, on the train that carries him away from the only life he had a right to. That image, held against the cheerful continuation of Armin Tamzarian pretending to be Seymour Skinner in the episodes that follow, is the show at its darkest and most precise. Springfield doesn't just forget inconvenient truths. It punishes them. It builds legal structures around the punishment. It ensures that the person carrying the inconvenient truth cannot return to deliver it again. And it does this with the full participation of the entire community, from the judge to the townspeople to the characters the audience has been rooting for through multiple seasons. This is the architecture of Springfield's denial. Not passive forgetting. Active, organized, legally enforced forgetting. The kind of forgetting that requires a mechanism and produces exiles. Every other theory in this video describes a cause of Springfield's impossible persistence. The principle and the pauper describes the method. It is the one episode that tells you not why the loop runs, but how. And the method is, you vote. You vote to keep the lie. And then you make it illegal to tell the truth. And then you send the truth away on a train. And then you go home. And the next episode starts. And everything is fine. The geographic impossibility of Springfield is not incidental to the show's other impossibilities. It is the same impossibility wearing different clothes. A town that cannot be located cannot be held accountable. A jurisdiction that floats between states has no fixed regulatory authority. The EPA cannot maintain consistent oversight of a nuclear facility in a state it cannot definitively identify. The state attorney general cannot pursue charges related to environmental contamination if the question of which state's law applies is permanently unresolved. Burns's plant has been operating in a jurisdictional gray zone for the entire history of the show, not by accident, but by design, and the design is not the writer's design. Within the logic of Springfield, the design belongs to Burns, a man who has been operating a facility with 342 safety violations for decades, a man who has watched a three-eyed fish become national news and survived the political fallout without meaningful consequence, understands the value of regulatory ambiguity. Burns has the resources and the connections to ensure that Springfield's location remains strategically unclear. He has politicians at every level of government. He has lawyers whose job is to create the precise kind of bureaucratic uncertainty that makes accountability structurally impossible. Springfield floats between states because floating between states is the most legally advantageous position for a nuclear facility that cannot survive proper inspection. This is not a conspiracy theory layered onto the show from outside. This is the internal logic of the character and the show's established facts taken to their conclusion. Burns is ruthless and brilliant, and has been managing his interests for over a century. Geographic ambiguity is exactly the kind of tool a man in his position would use, and the show has given him every resource he would need to deploy it. Matt Groening's 2012 confession to Smithsonian Magazine that Springfield was named after Springfield, Oregon, and that this was his hometown reference, lasted approximately 48 hours as a resolution to the mystery. The episodes that followed the interview continued contradicting the Oregon identification with the same casual indifference to geographic consistency that had characterized the show's entire run. The writers didn't honor the confession because the confession, however sincere, misunderstood the function of Springfield's location. It's not a mystery waiting to be solved. It's a mystery that serves the show's internal logic by remaining unsolved. A Springfield that is definitively located in Oregon is a Springfield that can be regulated by Oregon's environmental agencies, investigated by Oregon's law enforcement, and potentially held accountable to Oregon's courts. A Springfield that could be anywhere, that matches no single real state's geography, that borders Ohio and Nevada and Maine and Kentucky depending on which episode you're watching, is a Springfield that cannot be pinned down long enough for any regulatory body to establish jurisdiction. The geographic impossibility is the legal equivalent of the plot armor that protects Homer from injury. It's Springfield's institutional protection. The reason why, after everything the show has depicted, no federal agency has successfully intervened in any permanent way to address the plant's violations, the contamination, the billionaire running his private fiefdom with complete impunity. You cannot close a plant in a state that doesn't exist. You cannot prosecute crimes in a jurisdiction that floats. You cannot hold anyone accountable for anything when the accountable parties are located in a geography that reshapes itself around accountability attempts. Springfield is everywhere and nowhere. And everywhere and nowhere is the safest place to run a nuclear power plant that is slowly poisoning everyone who lives near it. The prediction phenomenon deserves more examination than it usually receives, because the two explanations that dominate the discourse, supernatural prophecy on one side, pure coincidence on the other, are both inadequate to the actual body of evidence. The coincidence explanation is the official one. Al Jean says it's darts and bullseyes. Volume plus time equals apparent accuracy. This is true as far as it goes. With nearly 800 episodes and thousands of satirical observations, some percentage will align with future events. The math is straightforward. The argument is honest. But it also undersells what the show's writing staff was actually doing, which was not throwing random darts but making careful, informed extrapolations from existing trends. The Trump prediction is the cleanest example of why the coincidence framing isn't quite right. Trump had been publicly flirting with political ambition since the late 1980s. He was a celebrity of a specific kind, the kind of celebrity whose fame was built on the performance of extreme wealth rather than on any particular talent, and whose name had been attached to political speculation repeatedly across multiple decades before the Bart to the Future episode aired in 2000. The writers who put Trump in the Oval Office as Lisa's predecessor weren't guessing randomly. They were taking a man who had been publicly performing presidential ambition and running him forward to his logical conclusion. That's not prophecy, that's extrapolation. And it's extrapolation from trends that were already visible to anyone paying careful attention to the specific kind of celebrity politics that was emerging in American culture at the turn of the millennium. The Disney-Fox merger prediction follows the same pattern. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend in the 1990s. The direction of that consolidation, toward a small number of massive entertainment conglomerates absorbing smaller studios, was already clearly established by the time the joke was written. The writers didn't predict the specific transaction. They predicted the direction of the trend and picked the most logical exemplar of it. Disney acquiring Fox was not a random outcome. It was the kind of outcome that trend analysis pointed toward years in advance. But then there are the cases that resist this explanation. The Siegfried and Roy Tiger attack is specific in a way that trend extrapolation doesn't fully account for. The show depicted not just that exotic animal performers are at risk from their animals, which is a general truth about a specific industry, but a white tiger attacking a performer in a way that maps closely to what actually happened to Roy Horn in 2003. The specificity of that match, the white tiger detail in particular, goes beyond what comfortable trend extrapolation explains. The cultural influence theory is the most interesting one and the least discussed. The Simpsons is not just a show that describes American culture. It is, after 36 years of continuous broadcast and near-total cultural saturation, a component of American culture. Its vocabulary has entered the language. Its observations have become reference points. Its satirical framings have become the lens through which a significant portion of the audience understands the phenomena the show is depicting. When The Simpsons depicts a Trump presidency as an obvious satirical endpoint of celebrity politics, that depiction enters the cultural bloodstream. It makes the idea familiar. It gives people a frame for understanding Trump's political ambitions before those ambitions fully materialized. And familiarity, the sense that this has already happened in some register of cultural experience, changes how new information is received. The Trump candidacy didn't arrive as a completely alien phenomenon to audiences who had seen the Bart to the Future episode. It arrived as something that already had a cultural location, a reference point, a frame. The show doesn't predict, the show prepares. And the things it prepares the culture for are, inevitably, the things that feel like predictions when they arrive. Hans Moleman's stated age of 31 is the most disturbing detail the show has ever deployed without examining it. Look at him. Look at the man the show is describing when it puts 31 years of age in his mouth. He is wizened and small and nearly blind and moves through Springfield with the fragile, tentative physicality of someone who has been old for a very long time. He looks to be in his 80s at minimum, possibly his 90s. He has the appearance of a man who has lived past the point where life was still comfortable to inhabit, and the show says he is 31. If this is true, if Moleman is genuinely 31 years old and his body is the body we see, then something accelerated his aging by 50 or 60 years. Something took a man in the early years of his adulthood and aged him to his apparent 90s in the time it would normally take to reach his actual 30s. The radiation theory has a name for what produces this outcome. Chronic exposure to ionizing radiation accelerates cellular aging. It damages DNA repair mechanisms. It produces in the body a cascade of degeneration that can compress decades of biological aging into a much shorter timeline. Moleman lives in Springfield. He drinks Springfield's water. He breathes Springfield's air. He has been doing this since before the show began. He is 31 years old, and he looks like he is 90 because the same contamination that gave Homer his impossible durability and gave Maggie her extraordinary cognition took everything from Moleman. Whatever the radiation does to an individual body depends on factors that are specific to that individual, their genetics, their baseline health, their particular vulnerability to specific types of radiation damage. Homer's body adapted toward resilience. Maggie's brain adapted toward brilliance. Moleman's body adapted toward collapse. The deaths are the part the show offers no direct explanation for. He dies, he comes back, he dies again, he comes back again. By any standard tracking of his canonical appearances, Moleman has died enough times to populate a small cemetery with versions of himself. And the show treats each death and each return with identical casualness, as if the cycle is unremarkable, as if dying and returning is simply what Moleman does. The collective denial theory explains this most cleanly. Springfield has agreed not to notice. The same social contract that allows the town to forget catastrophes between episodes allows it to forget Moleman's deaths within episodes. Someone dies, someone comes back, and by the time the scene moves on, the event has already been processed into the category of things Springfield doesn't officially acknowledge. Moleman joins that category automatically, reflexively, because Springfield has built the category processing into its basic social function. He is the most visible consequence of Springfield's refusal to examine itself. Every time he dies and comes back, the show is showing you, in compressed and comedic form, the full cycle of damage and denial and continuation that characterizes everything else happening in this town. Moleman is Springfield in miniature. He absorbs catastrophic harm. He does not recover in any meaningful sense. He simply continues, because continuation is what Springfield does, regardless of what it costs. The God question sits at the center of Ned Flanders' tragedy, and the show handles it with a sophistication that it never quite announces. Homer meets God in Season 4. Actual God, voiced and present, and having a conversation, telling Homer his time is coming, giving him theological content that Homer processes with his usual combination of good intentions and inadequate cognition. This is treated as a quirky episode beat, another example of Homer's bizarre relationship with the universe and the universe's bizarre relationship with Homer. But within the show's established canon, this meeting happened. God exists in Springfield's universe. God is accessible and communicative, at least to Homer. Ned Flanders has attended church every Sunday for 36 years. He has prayed with a consistency and a sincerity and a devotion that makes Homer's occasional theological conversation look like a casual acquaintance. He has built his entire moral architecture around his faith. He has forgiven things that most people in his position would not be able to forgive because his faith tells him to forgive. He has absorbed punishment after punishment, loss after loss, and responded each time by turning to the faith that structures his understanding of why these things are happening and what they mean. God has never spoken to him. The show doesn't make this explicit. It doesn't draw a scene where Ned prays and the silence is pointed and devastating. It doesn't need to, because the accumulation of 36 years of episodes in which God talks to Homer and never talks to Ned makes the point without needing to dramatize it. The most religiously devoted person in Springfield, the person whose faith is the most active and most practiced and most consistently expressed across the show's entire run, is precisely the person God does not communicate with. And Homer, who oversleeps on Sunday mornings and eats donuts during services and approaches theological questions with the cognitive sophistication of someone who once lodged a crayon in his brain, has multiple direct divine conversations. The show is not saying God favors Homer. The show is saying something more uncomfortable than that. It's saying that the universe of Springfield doesn't operate on the principle that devotion produces reward. It operates on a principle that is closer to randomness, or perhaps to the specific logic of the dream theory, where divine communication is a product of Homer's unconscious processing of religious imagery rather than actual theological contact. In the coma reading, Homer's God conversations are the dreaming brain producing religious experience from ambient cultural input. Ned's God silence is the dreaming brain not generating Ned's inner experience, because Ned is not Homer, and Homer's dream can only generate Ned's surface, not his depths. In the waking world reading, the one where Springfield is real and not a coma dream, the God silence is crueler. It means that the universe Springfield operates in does not validate devotion. It validates luck, or chaos, or the specific bizarre magnetism that Homer has always had for extreme experience. Ned prays and is silent. Homer stumbles and meets God. The moral calculus of Springfield is not a calculus that anyone who does everything right will ever win. Ned knows this, at some level. Not explicitly, not consciously, because conscious acknowledgement of this knowledge would collapse the faith that is the only thing keeping him functional after the behavioral conditioning and the losses and the decades of unrewarded devotion. But the breakdown scene, when the hurricane destroys his house and he screams at the town, shows you what is underneath the faith when the faith momentarily fails. Underneath is a man who has been waiting for years for the equation to balance, for the suffering to produce the reward, for the God he has been faithful to notice. The equation doesn't balance in Springfield. It never has. And Ned has been standing at the chalkboard for 36 years, adding up the same numbers and getting the same wrong answer, and going back to church on Sunday to try again. The flash-forward episodes are the show's most honest acknowledgement of what it is doing by refusing to let time pass. They exist as a genre of their own within the show's catalog, a separate category from the regular episodes and the Treehouse specials and the clip shows. They are the episodes where the show allows itself to imagine the future, where the constraint of the floating timeline is temporarily lifted, and the characters are allowed to age and change, and become the people that 36 years of story might plausibly have produced. Lisa's wedding is the first and in many ways the most complete of these. Lisa, at 23, engaged to an Englishman, returning to Springfield for the wedding that may or may not happen, navigating the complicated emotional geography of her family and her town from the position of an adult who has had enough time and enough distance to see it more clearly. The episode depicts her with extraordinary specificity. She is exactly the person the show has always implied she would become. Intelligent, principled, lonely in the specific way that intelligent people are often lonely, still trying to connect with a family that loves her but cannot quite meet her where she is. Her relationship with Homer in the episode is the most emotionally precise thing the show had produced to that point. He is still Homer. He is still inadequate in all the ways he has always been inadequate. And she loves him completely, inadequacy and all, because he is her father, and the inadequacy is inseparable from the love, and she has, by 23, learned to hold both at once. And then the episode ends. Lisa returns to being 8. The future is sealed back up. The adult Lisa exists in that one episode and then is inaccessible, the way a room in a house is inaccessible when the door is closed, present and real but not available. The show does this repeatedly. Bart to the future, holidays of future past, multiple other excursions into a future Springfield where the characters have aged and the world has changed, and the show briefly allows itself to imagine what lies on the other side of the freeze. And every time, the future is sealed back and the present is restored. What these episodes have in common is that they're all good. Not just competent, genuinely moving. The future versions of the characters tend to produce the show's most emotionally authentic work, precisely because the removal of the floating timeline constraint allows consequences to exist and accumulate in ways that the regular episodes cannot sustain. When characters are allowed to age, their experiences have weight. Their choices produce outcomes. Their relationships evolve in directions that the regular episodes can only gesture toward. The floating timeline, which the show maintains not out of laziness but out of structural necessity, is also the single greatest constraint on the show's emotional reach. It keeps the characters from developing. It keeps relationships from evolving. It keeps the Simpson family preserved in amber at the specific relational configuration they occupied in 1989. And that preservation, which is the source of the show's consistency and its cultural durability, is also the source of the melancholy that runs underneath every regular episode if you sit with it long enough. The characters are exactly who they were when you met them. They always will be. The future episodes show you who they would have become, and then they close the door. The audience is the one who keeps the door closed, not the writers, not the characters. We come back every week to see the family in the house in Springfield in the permanent present. We are the mechanism of the freeze. We are why the timeline floats. Because if we allowed it to land, if we pressed play and let 36 years actually pass, the show would end. And we're not ready for the show to end, not because the show is still surprising us, but because the show ending means admitting that the time is passing for us too. The Simpsons freeze is our freeze. The floating timeline is our floating timeline. We built it the same way Burns built Springfield, to preserve something we can't afford to lose. There is a specific quality to the way Springfield ignores the obvious that separates it from ordinary narrative convenience. In most television shows, when the audience is asked to overlook a logical inconsistency, the request is cosmetic. The writers need a plot to function, and the inconsistency is the price of the plot functioning, and the audience grants the request because the implicit contract of television storytelling permits small logical sacrifices in the service of story momentum. This is standard. This is not what Springfield is doing. Springfield's collective blindness to its own contamination is not a request that the audience overlook an inconsistency. It is the consistent, detailed, and evidentially supported depiction of a community that has been systematically prevented from perceiving its own situation clearly. The show is not asking you to ignore the three-eyed fish. The show is asking you to watch a community ignore the three-eyed fish and then think about what it means that they can. The three-eyed fish appears in Season 2. In terms of the show's early run, this is not a throwaway gag dropped in without forethought. It is a deliberate escalation of what the show has already established about the plant, a visible, undeniable piece of evidence that the contamination the plant produces has measurable effects on the biological life of Springfield's natural environment. The fish is caught from a river near the plant. The fish is displayed on national news. A gubernatorial candidate uses it as the centerpiece of an environmental argument. Burns is forced to eat the fish on television. And then the town moves on. The gubernatorial candidate loses the election. Burns wins the confrontation because he has the resources to control the narrative, and the town does not have the infrastructure to sustain its own outrage past the news cycle. The three-eyed fish becomes a cultural reference point within Springfield, rather than a catalyst for change. It becomes the kind of thing people mention rather than act on. It becomes, in the show's internal cultural economy, exactly what uncomfortable truths become in real communities when the structures of power around those truths are strong enough to absorb the shock and wait out the attention. This is not satire in the sense of exaggeration. This is documentary realism in cartoon form. Communities near real industrial facilities have watched real environmental contamination produce real biological mutations in local wildlife and have, repeatedly, in documented cases across American history, failed to translate that visible evidence into lasting change. The pattern the show is depicting has a history that the show's writers were aware of. The Simpsons did not invent the dynamic of corporate capture of environmental oversight. It identified a real dynamic and placed it inside a cartoon that ran long enough for the identification to become impossible to ignore. The 342 safety violations are the show's most precise piece of evidence, not because the number is so large, though it is, but because the show's response to those violations is so specific. Burns refuses to fix them, not because he cannot afford to, not because the fixes are technically impossible, because fixing them would require admitting they exist, and admitting they exist would open a line of inquiry that Burns has spent decades keeping closed. The violations are not accidents waiting to be corrected. They are features of a deliberate policy of minimal compliance with maximum plausible deniability. Homer's employment is the anchor of this policy. This has been discussed, but its full implications deserve the full space they require. Homer Simpson is the person whose legal responsibility it is to ensure that the Springfield nuclear plant does not poison the people who live near it. His title, his function, his reason for being in the building every day is safety. The safety inspector is the person who stands between the plant's operational ambitions and the town's exposure to the plant's operational reality. If the safety inspector does his job, the violations get reported, the regulatory agencies get involved, the plant either corrects its practices or gets shut down. Homer does not do his job. He has not done his job for the entire history of the show. He sleeps at his workstation. He eats during alarms. He has made operational errors that have produced nuclear incidents on multiple documented occasions. He is, by any objective assessment of his performance in his stated role, the most dangerous employee at the most dangerous facility in Springfield's history. And he was not hired by accident. When the German investors purchased the plant and fired Homer on their first day of ownership, the plant nearly went bankrupt from the estimated cost of bringing the facility up to code. The violations that Homer's negligence had allowed to accumulate over years of employment represented a liability so massive that a competent management team was nearly destroyed by the estimate alone. Burns bought the plant back. Burns rehired Homer. The sequence is the evidence. Burns understood exactly what Homer's continued employment meant for the plant's operational reality. He understood it because he designed it. Homer's incompetence is not a cost Burns tolerates, it is an asset Burns maintains. And the population that lives near the plant, the people who drink the water and breathe the air and send their children to the school whose budget was gutted when Burns stole the oil from under the foundation, they cannot challenge this. They cannot challenge it because the mechanisms of challenge, regulatory oversight and legal accountability, and political pressure and organized community action, are all captured in one way or another by the same structure of wealth and influence that maintains Homer's employment and Burns's operational freedom. The plant is not just an environmental threat to Springfield. It is the organizing principle of Springfield's political and economic life. The town cannot function without the plant. The plant cannot be challenged without destroying the town's economy. Burns has ensured that these two facts are true simultaneously, and the ensuring took a lifetime, but he has had a lifetime to do it. This is the full shape of the radiation theory. Not just that the plant is poisoning the water, not just that the residents show signs of biological mutation, but that the contamination is embedded in the economic and political and legal structure of the town so thoroughly that the contamination cannot be addressed without dismantling the town itself. The yellow skin and the four fingers and the three-eyed fish are the surface expression of a problem that goes all the way down through the soil and the water and the air and the regulatory apparatus and the political machinery and the 3 generations of Simpsons who have been shaped by their proximity to a facility that should have been shut down before Homer was born. Springfield is a contamination zone. Its residents are symptomatic, its structures are compromised, and the man responsible for this has been alive for over a century, managing his own radiation-dependent biology with resources no one else in town can access, watching the slow-motion consequence of his choices play out across every yellow face and every forgotten catastrophe, and every episode that ends with the family intact and the loop running and everything exactly as it was. He glows in the dark, he always has, and Springfield looks at the glow and says it must be an alien, because the alternative, the truth the glow is expressing, is too large and too close and too expensive to see clearly. Every episode of The Simpsons ends the same way. The credits roll, the family is on the couch, the television is on, the house is intact. Whatever happened in the preceding 22 minutes, whatever catastrophe was survived or averted or absorbed or forgotten, the final image is the family together in the living room on Evergreen Terrace, exactly where they started. This is formally described as the show's status quo restoration, the episodic television convention of returning characters to their baseline configuration at the episode's end so that the next episode can begin from the same starting point. It is a feature of the format, not a choice specific to The Simpsons, and most analysis of it stops here, at the level of format analysis. But The Simpsons has run for 36 years. The couch is in thousands of episodes. The family has sat down together in that specific configuration so many times that the image has accumulated a weight that no other single image in American television carries. The family on the couch is not just a status quo restoration at this point. It is an icon. It is the visual condensation of the entire show, the image that contains everything the show has been saying for 36 years inside a single composition. And what does that image say? It says the family survived. It says they're together. It says that whatever the episode did to them, whatever the world of Springfield demanded from them, whatever Burns orchestrated or the radiation produced or the floating timeline preserved or the collective denial enabled, none of it was enough to separate them from each other and from this room and from this couch. The loop runs and they come back to each other, and the television is on and the house holds. If the coma theory is true, this image is the core of Homer's dream. Not the adventures, not the celebrity encounters, not the space travel or the vigilante group or the meeting with presidents. The couch, the family on the couch. Homer's deepest dream is not the extraordinary experiences the post-coma seasons pile on. His deepest dream is the ordinary one. The family in the living room, together, safe, not going anywhere. If the radiation theory is true, the couch is the evidence that some things survive contamination. The plant can poison the water and damage the biology, and compromise the cognition and capture the political structures and buy the doctors and fund the cover-ups. But it cannot poison this. The love that puts this specific family on this specific couch in this specific configuration at the end of every episode is not something Burns can lease or capture or compromise. He has never tried to, because it has never occurred to him that this is the thing worth trying to capture. Burns understands power. He does not understand what the couch represents. If the floating timeline theory is true, the couch is what the freeze is protecting. We don't let time pass in Springfield, because time passing means the family changes, means the children grow, means the couch eventually holds different people in different configurations. The freeze exists to protect the image, to keep the family in the exact arrangement that we first saw them in, that we fell in love with them in, that we keep returning to because it is the arrangement that feels most like home to us. Not just to Homer, to us. The theories we have followed through these hours are all true in the ways that matter. The plant is poisoning Springfield. Homer's coma has been running since 1993. Burns is too old and too expensive to die. Maggie is waiting for the right moment. The town votes to forget. Springfield cannot be found on any map. The timeline floats because we keep it floating. All of these things are simultaneously true. They are not competing explanations. They are layers of the same thing, the same show, the same story, the same image. The family on the couch, the television on, the house intact, the loop running, and somewhere in Springfield, Maggie is watching all of it from the corner of the room. She has been watching for 36 years. She hasn't said anything. She won't say anything, not yet. But she is watching. She is noting. She is assembling, in the patient and extraordinary mind that the show has given her and that the town cannot see, the full picture of what Springfield is and what it has done to the people she loves. And when she finally decides to speak, when she finally breaks the 36-year silence and says the thing she has been composing since before she could walk, Springfield will not be ready. No one will be ready, because no one has been paying attention to the baby in the corner. The last mystery is not what Maggie will do. The last mystery is whether she'll get the chance to do it before the loop finally stops. Springfield is waiting. The family is on the couch. The television is on. There is a moment in the show, not a single episode but a category of moment, that appears with enough regularity across the run that it forms its own quiet argument. It is the moment when the show steps slightly outside itself, when the writing acknowledges in some oblique or direct way that it is aware of what it is doing. These moments are not breaking the fourth wall in the conventional comedic sense. They are something more thoughtful and more carefully deployed. The 138th episode Spectacular, hosted by Troy McClure, is one of these. A clip show in the most conventional sense, it is also a meditation on the show's relationship with its own history, its own mythology, its own constructed reality. Troy McClure, a character who exists as satire of a specific kind of Hollywood persona, the faded star perpetually attached to increasingly dubious projects, hosts a celebration of Springfield that is also, if you pay attention to the specific jokes the show is making, a gentle acknowledgement that Springfield's reality is constructed, selected, edited, and presented rather than simply depicted. The alternate Smithers ending is shown and dismissed. The act of showing and then dismissing it draws attention to the fact that the official ending is also a choice, also a selection from a range of possible answers. The season 34 fake deleted scene, where Homer appears to wake from a coma and reveal that everything has been a dream, is a more recent version of the same self-awareness. The show creates the scene. The show broadcasts the scene through what it then claims was an unauthorized leak. The show then dismisses it as a hoax. 3 stages of engagement with a theory that the show has been aware of for decades, staged and performed, and then denied in a sequence that is itself a commentary on how Springfield handles inconvenient truths. The show made it, showed it, and then said it wasn't real. This is exactly what Springfield does with everything else. The writers know the theories. The producers know the theories. The decades of interviews and commentary tracks and public statements from the show's creative team make this clear. They have engaged with the coma theory, the radiation theory, the who shot Burns mystery, the geographic impossibility. They have commented on them, dismissed some, acknowledged others, and continued making a show that generates new evidence for all of them with every season. The most honest thing any of them have said comes not from a public statement, but from the accumulated body of work itself. The show keeps producing material that fits the theories. After decades of being told by the creative team that Springfield is just a cartoon town, and Homer just had a bad day, and the fish has 3 eyes because it's funny, and the timeline floats because that's how animated television works, the show keeps making episodes that fit the framework the theories describe. Burns keeps doing things that fit the radiation conspiracy. The town keeps forgetting things in ways that fit the collective denial model. Homer keeps surviving things that fit the coma theory. Maggie keeps doing things that fit the hidden genius reading. Either the writers are unconsciously producing evidence for theories they consciously reject, or the theories describe something real about the show's deep structure that the creative team built in and maintains without fully articulating it, or the two possibilities are not as distinct as they might seem. The deep structure of a show built and maintained over 36 years by hundreds of writers across dozens of seasons is not something that any individual fully controls or fully understands. It emerges from the accumulated choices of everyone who has ever written for Springfield, shaped by the original vision and the constraints of the format and the expectations of the audience and the internal logic of the world the show has built. The theories exist because that deep structure is visible to the attentive viewer as something coherent and consistent and darker than any individual episode presents on its own. The radiation is real in the sense that the show consistently depicts its effects. The coma is real in the sense that the show consistently depicts a world that matches what a coma dream would produce. The denial is real in the sense that the show consistently depicts a community that chooses the comfortable fiction. None of these are impositions from outside the show. They are distillations of what the show has been building since the 17th of December, 1989. Springfield knows what it is. The show has always known what it is. It just can't say it directly. So it says it through the yellow skin, and the floating timeline, and the 3-eyed fish, and the baby who waits, and the grandfather who glows, and the family on the couch, and the loop that runs every Sunday night and never, ever stops. That's the final theory. The show is conscious of itself. Not in the way that a person is conscious, not with intention and decision-making, but in the way that a structure is conscious of its own weight, present in every beam and every foundation, never declared but always there. Springfield is aware of Springfield, and it has been building the case against itself, episode by episode, for 36 years, for anyone paying close enough attention to read it. You've been paying attention. You found this. You pressed play, or you let it play, or someone had it on in the background and you found yourself still listening an hour in when you'd planned to be asleep by now. That's not an accident. That's the show working the way it's always worked. You meant to stop paying attention, and instead you found yourself paying more attention, pulled deeper into Springfield by the exact combination of comfort and unease that has kept this show running for longer than most entertainment properties survive. The comfort is real. The Simpsons is genuinely comforting. Not despite what the theories reveal, but because of it. There is something deeply reassuring about a family that cannot be destroyed, about a home that always looks the same, about characters who have survived everything and come back to the same couch, the same house, the same loop, week after week after week. In a world where everything changes and nothing stays and the ground shifts under every certainty, Springfield stays. Homer comes home, the beer is cold, the family is there. That's the oldest story there is. The hero who goes out into the world, faces the impossible, and returns. Springfield runs this story on a weekly basis. Homer faces the impossible every episode. The plant, the boss, the schemes, the disasters, the physical comedy of a man whose body should have given out decades ago. And he comes back to the couch, to Marge, to the kids, to the house on Evergreen Terrace where the lights are on and the door is unlocked, because it was never really about the adventure. The adventure is the shape the love takes when it has to go out into the world. The house is what the love is for. You are not so different from Homer Simpson. This is not an insult. This is the show's oldest and truest compliment. The man who wants too much and understands too little, and loves more than he can express, and survives more than he should, and comes home, again and again and again, to the family that was always the point. The show has been telling you this for 36 years. Not through its theories, not through its mysteries, but through its couch, its credits, its loop. Whatever darkness the theories illuminate, and they illuminate real darkness, the show built underneath all of it a foundation that the darkness cannot reach. Homer loves his family. This is the fact that every theory eventually arrives at when it follows the evidence far enough. The radiation explains the mutations, but not the love. The coma explains the freeze, but not what Homer is dreaming about. Burns explains the structure, but not what the structure fails to capture. The denial explains the forgetting, but not what is never forgotten. The family is never forgotten. The family is never lost. The loop runs and they come back to each other and the credits roll and the next week it starts again. That's the theory that doesn't need evidence because it's the whole show. Every child born in Springfield inherits a debt they did not incur. Bart Simpson was born into a town already contaminated, to parents already exposed, in the shadow of a plant already leaking. He did not choose this. He arrived into it the way all children arrive into their circumstances, without selection or consent, accepting the world as presented, because the world as presented is all there is when you're 10 years old and have been 10 years old since before your parents were your age now. Bart is the child the show uses to dramatize what it means to grow up in a system that fails you. He is not stupid. The show established this early and has maintained it. He is actually intelligent, in specific ways that school cannot measure and Springfield cannot reward. He is quick, adaptive, creative in the horizontal sense of finding solutions through unexpected angles rather than the vertical sense of accumulating approved knowledge. He is precisely the kind of mind that a different environment might have developed into something extraordinary. In Springfield, it develops into a 10-year-old boy who pranks authority figures and gets in trouble and goes to bed and wakes up and is 10 years old again. The floating timeline denies Bart the thing that children are supposed to have, which is a future. Not the future of plot, the future of development, the organic accumulation of experience into something more than what you were yesterday. Bart is locked in the moment of childhood that is most characterized by potential and least characterized by realization. He has the potential he has always had, and he will never have the age to realize it. Lisa is the same, frozen at 8, the moment of maximum clarity and minimum power, seeing everything and able to change nothing. Maggie is frozen at 1, the moment of beginning, the whole life still ahead, and the capability already extraordinary. These children are not cartoons in the sense of being simplified or flattened. They are cartoons in the original sense of the word, preliminary drawings. Sketches of what a human being might become. Springfield never lets the sketch become the painting. It keeps them in the preliminary stage, permanently, beautifully, heartbreakingly preliminary. The most radical act the show could perform would be to let them grow up. To let Bart turn 11 and Lisa turn 9 and Maggie take her first real steps into a future the show has been promising for 3.5 decades. The show will not do this. Not because it can't, because we won't let it. Because the sketch is what we love. Because the painting would be something we'd have to say goodbye to. And Springfield, with all its impossibilities and all its darkness and all the theories we've spent these hours following, is the one place none of us are ready to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Good night.